My daughter kept trembling as we walked down the aisle, and I thought it was just nerves. But when the priest asked if anyone objected, she didn't look at her fiancé. She looked at me with eyes full of terror and slipped a crumpled note from her bouquet into my hand that read, "Dad, help me. He knows about the lie." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply reached into my tuxedo jacket, pulled out my licensed revolver, and fired a shot into the ceiling, turning the most expensive wedding in Atlanta into a crime scene. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from a wolf in sheep's clothing. My name is Thaddeus King, and at 72 years old, I have built half the skyscrapers in downtown Atlanta with my own two hands. I know the difference between a solid foundation and a structure that is about to collapse, and standing there in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton surrounded by crystal chandeliers and imported lilies, I knew this wedding was built on quicksand. The tuxedo I was wearing felt like a straitjacket. It was too tight across the shoulders, and the starch in the collar was digging into my neck, but my daughter Zoe had insisted. She wanted everything to be perfect for Connor. Connor Sterling. The man waiting at the altar looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. He was 30 years old with perfectly gelled blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His family sat on the left side of the room, a sea of designer suits and pearls whispering behind their hands every time they looked at me. To them, I was just the old black man who paid the bills. They didn't see the 40 years of sweating in the Georgia sun or the calluses on my hands that paid for this $100,000 reception. They just saw an outsider. I was used to that look. I had seen it in boardrooms and banks my whole life, but today it bothered me more than usual because today was supposed to be about love. 10 minutes before the ceremony started, Connor had cornered me in the bridal suite hallway. He didn't ask how I was feeling or how beautiful my daughter looked. He leaned in close, smelling of expensive scotch and peppermint, and whispered, "Thaddeus, did you bring the deed to the ranch?" I looked at him squarely in the eye. The King Legacy Ranch was not just dirt and grass. It was 200 acres of land that my grandfather bought when people like us weren't allowed to own anything. It was where I taught Zoe to ride a horse. It was where my late wife Beatrice was buried under the old oak tree. I told him we could discuss business after the honeymoon, but Connor's smile vanished. He gripped my arm a little too tightly and said, "We need to settle this today, Thaddeus. The market is volatile and my investors are waiting. Zoe wants this too. She wants to start our life with a clean slate and liquid assets. Don't be the stubborn old man standing in the way of her happiness." I pulled my arm away and dusted off the sleeve of my jacket. I told him that if he touched me again, he would need a dentist, not a priest. He laughed it off, patting my shoulder like I was a senile uncle, but as he walked away, I saw a flash of something in his eyes. It wasn't love, it was hunger. Pure, unadulterated greed. The music started playing. It was a classical piece played by a live string quartet. The heavy oak doors swung open and the guests stood up. I turned to look at my daughter. Zoe looked like an angel in her white lace gown, but her face was pale. Too pale. Her hands were shaking so badly that the bouquet of white roses was vibrating. I took her arm to steady her. Her skin was ice cold. "Baby girl, breathe," I whispered to her. "It is just a walk." She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "Daddy," she whispered, and her voice was so broken it nearly tore my heart in two. "Daddy, I don't know if I can do this." I stopped walking. We were only a few steps down the aisle. The guests were watching us, smiling their fake plastic smiles, thinking this was just an emotional father-daughter moment. I squeezed her hand. "Zoe, if you don't want to do this, say the word. We will turn around right now. The truck is parked out front. We can go get burgers and forget this whole circus." She looked up then, and for a split second I saw hope in her eyes. But then she looked towards the altar. Connor was standing there watching us. He wasn't smiling anymore. He tapped his wristwatch subtly, a gesture only she could see. The fear came crashing back into her eyes like a tidal wave. "No," she said, her voice trembling. We have to. We have to keep going." My gut was screaming that something was wrong. In my line of work, you develop a sixth sense for danger. You know when a cable is about to snap or a wall is about to give way. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I walked her down that aisle. I delivered her to him. When Connor took her hand, he squeezed it hard. I saw her wince. He leaned in and kissed her cheek, but it looked more like he was whispering a threat than a term of endearment. I took my seat in the front row. The wooden pew felt hard and unforgiving. I watched the back of Connor's neck and imagined wrapping my hands around it. The priest began the ceremony droning on about love and faithfulness and sacred vows. I tuned him out. I was scanning the room. Why were there 4 security guards at the exits? This was a wedding, not a presidential visit. And why did Connor's best man have a bulge under his jacket that looked suspiciously like a shoulder holster? Then came the moment that changed everything. The priest cleared his throat and asked the question that usually gets met with silence. If anyone here has just cause why this couple should not be united in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence in the room was heavy. I shifted in my seat ready to bite my tongue. But then Zoe moved. She didn't speak. She let go of Connor's hand. He tried to grab her back, his face twisting into a scowl, but she was faster. She pretended to adjust the train of her dress and turned towards me. Her movements were jerky and desperate. She reached into the center of her bouquet and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was no bigger than a gum wrapper. She thrust it towards me. Her eyes were pleading, screaming without sound. Connor lunged forward. Zoe, no, he hissed, abandoning his charming facade entirely. But I already had the paper. I unfolded it, my old fingers fumbling slightly. The handwriting was hurried, scrawled in lipstick on the back of a receipt. Dad, help me. He knows about the lie. The lie. The words echoed in my brain. What lie? What could my sweet, innocent Zoe possibly have done that would give this man so much power over her? And then I looked at Connor. He wasn't looking at Zoe. He was looking at me, and the look on his face was pure malice. He took a step towards me, his hand reaching into his jacket. I didn't think. I reacted. Instincts from 50 years ago kicked in. I stood up and kicked the heavy pew in front of me, creating a barrier. My hand went to the small of my back beneath my tuxedo jacket. I felt the cold, comforting steel of my .38 Special. I had a concealed carry permit, and I never went anywhere without it, especially not to a room full of people I didn't trust. Connor's security guards started moving towards us. The guests gasped. I drew the weapon. I didn't point it at Connor, not yet. I pointed it straight up at the glass skylight above us and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. It wasn't a pop like in the movies, it was a thunderclap that shook the room. Shards of glass rained down onto the empty aisle like diamonds. Screams erupted. The string quartet stopped playing. People dove under tables. I didn't flinch. I leveled the gun at Connor, who was now frozen in place, his face white as a sheet. The wedding is over, I roared, my voice booming over the chaos. Everyone get out. Now. Connor looked at the gun, then at me. You are making a big mistake, old man, he sneered, trying to regain control. You have no idea what you are doing. You just signed her death warrant. I cocked the hammer of the revolver. The click was loud enough to be heard in the sudden silence. I said, get out. I grabbed Zoe's hand. She was sobbing now, but she gripped my hand like it was the only lifeline in a storm. We are leaving, baby girl, I told her. We are going home. But as we backed away towards the side exit, keeping the gun trained on Connor and his goons, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Connor pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. A second later, the heavy double doors at the back of the room slammed shut. The security guards blocked the exits, crossing their arms. Connor smiled a cruel, triumphant smile. Nobody leaves, he said calmly. Not until I get what is mine. I looked at Zoe. I looked at the blocked doors. I looked at the terrified guests. I realized then that this wasn't just a wedding gone wrong. This was a trap. And we had walked right into the center of it. I tightened my grip on the gun and looked my daughter in the eye. Stay behind me, I whispered. I am Thaddeus King, and I have survived race riots, recessions, and heart attacks. I wasn't about to let a man in a silk suit take my daughter from me. If he wanted a war, he was about to get one right here in the Ritz-Carlton. This is the story of how a wedding note uncovered a conspiracy that went deeper than I ever could have imagined. The smell of cordite hung heavy in the ballroom air, mixing unpleasantly with the scent of expensive perfume and fear. Chaos is a strange thing. In my years on construction sites, I have seen cranes collapse and scaffolding give way, and the reaction is always the same. First, there is a split second of absolute silence where the brain tries to process the impossible, and then the screaming starts. The guests at the Ritz-Carlton were no different. Men in three-piece suits were diving under tables, knocking over crystal champagne flutes, while women in designer gowns were trampling over each other to get to the exits that Connor had locked. I didn't look at the chaos. My eyes were locked on Connor Sterling. He hadn't run. He stood his ground, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage that made him look less like a groom and more like a cornered animal. He took a step toward Zoe, ignoring the revolver I still held at my side. "You crazy old lunatic," Connor shouted, spitting the words out. "You are ruining her future. Do you have any idea what you have just done? You have destroyed everything." He lunged forward, his hand reaching out to grab Zoe's arm. I saw the way his fingers curled like talons. He wasn't reaching for a lover, he was reaching for property. He wanted to drag her back to the altar and force her to say "I do" at gunpoint if he had to. I couldn't let that happen. I stepped in between them. I am 72 years old and my joints ache when it rains, but I spent 3 tours in Vietnam before I ever laid a single brick in Atlanta. Muscle memory is a powerful thing. As Connor reached out, I didn't shoot him. That would have been too easy, and I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life in a cell for a man like him. Instead, I dropped the gun into my pocket and caught his wrist with my left hand. Connor looked surprised. He expected me to be slow. He expected the frailty of age. What he got was a grip forged by lifting steel beams and swinging sledgehammers for 40 years. I twisted his arm behind his back in a standard joint lock, pushing his wrist up toward his shoulder blade until I heard the distinct pop of cartilage. Connor yelped, dropping to his knees to alleviate the pressure. The arrogance vanished from his face, replaced by shock and pain. I leaned down close to his ear so only he could hear me over the screaming guests. "Listen to me very carefully, boy," I whispered, my voice low and steady. "If you ever try to touch my daughter again, I will not break your wrist. I will snap it off and feed it to you. Do you understand me?" I shoved him forward and he sprawled onto the polished floor, clutching his arm. I didn't wait for his answer. I grabbed Zoe's hand. "Run," I said. We moved through the crowd. I used my shoulders to clear a path, bulldozing through a cluster of Connor's college friends who were too terrified to stop us. Zoe was crying silent tears, her makeup running down her face, but she kept pace with me, hitching up her heavy wedding dress with one hand and holding on to me with the other. The security guards at the main doors hesitated. They were hired muscle paid to look intimidating, but they weren't ready for a situation like this. They looked at me, a 6'2" black man with fire in his eyes and a bulge in his jacket pocket, and then they looked at Connor writhing on the floor. They made the smart choice. They stepped aside. We burst out of the hotel lobby and into the humid Atlanta afternoon. The valet stand was cluttered with Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Bentleys. It was a parking lot full of egos. The young valet looked at us with wide eyes, taking in Zoe's disheveled wedding dress and my thunderous expression. My truck, I barked at him. "The Ford. Now." He scrambled to the key rack. A minute later, he pulled up in my 1995 Ford F-150. It was a rusted beast of a vehicle sitting high on mud tires, its red paint faded by decades of sun. It stuck out like a sore thumb amongst the luxury sports cars, but to me, it was beautiful. It was real. It was reliable. And unlike everything back in that ballroom, it was paid for. "Get in, Zoe," I said, opening the heavy passenger door. She climbed in, tearing the tulle of her dress on the running board, but she didn't care. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life with a familiar rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. I threw it into gear and peeled out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of black diesel smoke to settle over the pristine entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. We didn't speak for the first 10 miles. I drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, checking for tails. I wove through traffic, heading towards the interstate, pushing the old truck as hard as she would go. My heart was hammering in my chest, but my hands on the wheel were steady. I reached over and turned on the CB radio mounted under the dashboard. It was an old habit from my contracting days, keeping an ear on the traffic and the police bands. Static filled the cab, followed by the crackly voice of a dispatcher. "All units be advised, we have a 1070 at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. Suspect is identified as Thaddeus King, male black, 72 years of age, armed and dangerous." I listened as the dispatcher continued. "Proceed with extreme caution. Suspect has prior military training and extensive knowledge of the city infrastructure. Do not engage without backup." I repeat, do not engage. I let out a short, bitter laugh. They still remembered. Back in the 80s, when I was building the foundation for the city courthouse, the unions tried to shut me down because of the color of my skin. They sent guys with baseball bats to my construction site. Those guys left in ambulances and I finished the job ahead of schedule. I had a reputation in this town. A reputation that said Thaddeus King was a man you didn't corner unless you were ready for a fight. I glanced over at Zoe. She was curled up in the passenger seat, hugging her knees to her chest. The white dress was ruin-stained with grease from the truck and dirt from the floor. She looked so small, so fragile. The anger I felt toward Connor was replaced by a wave of protective tenderness. "We are going to the ranch, baby girl," I said softly. "We will be safe there. The gates are reinforced steel and I have enough supplies to last us a month. Nobody is getting in. Nobody is getting—" Zoe nodded, but she didn't look at me. She was staring at her phone, which she had been gripping so tight her knuckles were white. I thought about tossing the phone out the window. It was a tracking device and I knew Connor would try to ping it. But before I could ask her for it, the phone buzzed. It wasn't a ringtone, it was a single sharp vibration that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cab. Zoe flinched. She looked down at the screen and the color drained from her face completely, leaving her looking like a ghost. Her breath hitched in her throat and she started shaking again violently. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. "Is it him?" She couldn't speak. She just held the phone up so I could see it. I risked a glance. It was a text message from Connor. There were no words, just a video file attached and a single line of text underneath it. "You think that old man can save you? I am sending this to the police precinct right now. Enjoy prison, darling." I looked back at the road, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until the leather creaked. The wedding was over, but the nightmare had just begun. Connor Sterling wasn't just a greedy real estate developer. He was a predator who had spent months setting a trap, and even though we had escaped the cage, he still held the leash. I pushed the accelerator down. The old Ford roared in protest, pushing past 70 miles per hour. "Let him send it," I said, my voice cold as ice. "Let him send whatever he has. We are going to ground Zoe, and when we come back up, we are going to burn his whole world down." But as I looked at my daughter sobbing silently in the passenger seat, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We were running a race against time and Connor had a head start. I needed to know what was in that video. I needed to know what the lie was, because you can't fight a war if you don't know what weapon the enemy is using. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything." Zoe took a shuddering breath and looked out the window at the passing trees. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the highway. "It happened 6 months ago," she whispered, "on the night of the storm." And as she began to speak, I realized that the note in the bouquet was just the tip of the iceberg. The truth was far darker and more dangerous than I ever could have imagined. The gravel crunched under the tires of the old Ford truck as we passed the wooden archway that read King Legacy Ranch. It was the only sound in the world besides the ragged breathing of my daughter sitting next to me. The sun had fully set and the Georgia pines cast long black shadows across the road that looked like the bars of a prison cell. I didn't turn on the headlights until we were well past the main road. I knew this land better than I knew the back of my own hand. I knew every dip in the dirt, every twist in the creek, and every fence post I had driven into the ground myself 40 years ago. This ranch was my sanctuary. It was 300 acres of rolling hills and hardwood timber that I had bought with the money from my first big contracting job back in 1982. People called me crazy then. They said a black man had no business owning this much land in this part of the county. They burned crosses on my lawn and poisoned my dogs, but I didn't leave. I built a fence. Then I built a house. Then I built a legacy. And now, looking at the trembling woman in the passenger seat wearing a ruined wedding dress, I realized I might lose it all before the sun came up tomorrow. I pulled the truck up to the main house. It was a sturdy log cabin built from cedar and stone. I killed the engine, and the silence of the countryside rushed in to fill the cab. Crickets chirped in the high grass and an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. It sounded peaceful, but I knew it was the calm before the storm. Inside, I didn't turn on the main lights. I lit a kerosene lamp on the kitchen table. The soft yellow glow illuminated the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I looked at the photos on the mantel. Me and my late wife Beatrice on our honeymoon, Zoe on her first pony, the day Zoe graduated college. A lifetime of memories protected by these 4 walls. Zoe sat at the heavy oak dining table staring at her hands. She had stopped crying, but the silence was worse. It was the silence of someone who had given up. I walked over to the liquor cabinet and pulled out a bottle of Kentucky bourbon. I poured 2 glasses, one for me and a stiff one for her. I slid the glass across the table. The sound of the glass scraping against the wood made her jump. "Drink," I said. My voice was calm, but it left no room for argument. "It will steady your nerves." She picked up the glass with both hands, her fingers shaking so much the amber liquid sloshed over the sides. She took a sip and coughed as the alcohol burned its way down. "Now," I said, sitting opposite her, "we are going to talk about the lie, and you are going to tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and do not leave out a single detail." Zoe looked at me. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in black streaks, making her look like a tragic clown. She took a deep breath and the dam broke. "It was 6 months ago, Dad," she whispered. "The night of the thunderstorm. Remember when I told you I stayed at Connor's apartment because the roads were flooded?" I nodded slowly. I remembered. "It was a Tuesday. I didn't stay there," she continued, her voice trembling. "I was driving home. I had a glass of wine at dinner, but I wasn't drunk, Dad. I swear I wasn't. The rain was coming down so hard I couldn't see anything. The wipers couldn't keep up. I was on that dark stretch of road near the old mill." She paused, taking another sip of the bourbon. Her eyes lost focus, as if she was replaying a horror movie in her head. Suddenly, something ran out in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes, but the road was slick. "I felt the impact, Dad. It was a heavy thud. It sickened me. I spun out and hit the guardrail. I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the table." "Did you get out?" I asked. "Yes," she sobbed. "I got out. I was terrified. There was a man lying in the ditch. He wasn't moving. There was blood. So much blood. I panicked. I reached for my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so bad I dropped it in the mud. And then Connor pulled up." "Connor?" I asked. "How did he know you were there?" "He was following me home," she said, "to make sure I was safe, or so I thought. He jumped out of his car and ran to the ditch. He checked the man's pulse. He looked at me and said, 'Zoe, he is dead. You killed him.'" I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "Go on," I said. "He told me that because I had alcohol in my system, no one would believe it was an accident," she said, picking at the lace on her dress. "He said I would go to prison for vehicular manslaughter. He said my life would be over. He said your reputation would be destroyed. He told me to get in his car. He said he would take care of it." "And you let him," I stated flatly. "I was scared, Dad," she cried. "I was a coward. I got in his car. He drove me to his place. He went back to the scene alone. He came back 2 hours later and said it was done. He said he moved the body. He said he wiped the car. He said I was safe as long as I kept my mouth shut." I sat back in my chair, running a hand over my bald head. I had been in the construction business long enough to know when a structure didn't look right. Connor Sterling was a venture capitalist, not a crime scene cleaner. He didn't get his hands dirty for anyone unless there was a profit to be made. "So where does the blackmail come in?" I asked. 2 weeks later, she whispered, "I tried to break up with him. He was becoming controlling, checking my phone, telling me what to wear. When I told him it was over, he opened his laptop. He showed me a video I repeated. His dash cam," she said. "It recorded everything. It recorded me hitting the man. It recorded me crying and saying I had been drinking. It recorded him checking the body. He told me that if I ever tried to leave him, he would send the video to the district attorney. He said he owned me." The room fell silent again. The kerosene lamp flickered. I looked at my daughter. She wasn't a criminal. She was a victim of a well-executed trap. But something was missing. Connor was wealthy. He came from old money. Why go through all this trouble for a girl he clearly didn't love? Why force a marriage? Why the ranch? I asked aloud. It wasn't really a question for her. I was thinking out loud. "He kept asking about the deed," she said, sniffing. "He said that once we were married, he could protect my assets better if the ranch was in his name. He said it was just a formality. He said if I signed the land over to him, he would destroy the video on our wedding night. That was his wedding gift to me." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the dark expanse of my property. It was just trees and hills. It wasn't prime real estate. It was too far from the city for a shopping mall, and the terrain was too rough for a luxury housing development. So why was a man like Connor Sterling willing to commit a felony to get his hands on it? "He doesn't want you, Zoe," I said, turning back to her. "It hurts to hear, but you need to know this. He doesn't love you. He doesn't even hate you. You are just a signature on a contract to him." Zoe put her head in her hands and sobbed. "I know," she choked out. "I know." I walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. It is not your fault, baby girl. He preyed on your fear. That is what cowards do. But there is something you need to understand. A man like Connor doesn't clean up a mess unless the payout is bigger than the risk. He didn't just want a wife. He wanted this land, desperately. I poured myself another drink. My mind was racing. What was under this dirt? Was it oil, gold, rare earth minerals? Whatever it was worth enough for Connor to stage a crime scene. Wait, I said, freezing. Did you ever see the body on the news? Did you ever hear about a missing person report in the area? Zoe looked up, her eyes confused. No, she said. I checked the papers for weeks. I was terrified I would see his picture, but there was nothing. Connor said he made the body disappear. He said he had connections. I swirled the bourbon in my glass. Connections. Or maybe there was never a body to begin with. Maybe the man in the ditch was just an actor in a very expensive play. Before I could voice this theory, a sound cut through the quiet night air like a knife. It started low, a distant wail rising and falling. Then came another, and another. I blew out the kerosene lamp, plunging the room into darkness. I moved quickly to the window and peered through the blinds. Down at the main gate, about a mile away, blue and red lights were flashing against the tree line. It looked like a Christmas tree from hell. There were at least 6 cruisers. He didn't waste any time, I muttered. Dad. Zoe whispered, her voice rising in panic. Is that the police? I watched as the gate I had built with reinforced steel rattled under the impact of a ram. They were coming in. Connor called them, I said, checking the load in my revolver even though I knew I couldn't use it against cops. He didn't send the video of the accident, Zoe. That would implicate him as an accessory. Then why are they here? She asked, grabbing my arm. Because I took you from the altar, I said grimly. In the eyes of the law, I just kidnapped a grown woman at gunpoint. He flipped the script. He is the grieving fiancé, and I am the unstable father who snapped. The sirens grew louder as the convoy of police cars sped up the long driveway. The blue light swept across the front of the cabin, illuminating the fear on Zoe's face. We are trapped, Dad, she cried. What do we do? I looked at her. I looked at the flashing lights. And then I looked at the floorboards beneath the rug in the corner of the room. My grandfather had built this cabin during Prohibition. He knew a thing or two about hiding things from the law. We don't panic, I said, grabbing her hand. And we don't surrender, not to him. I dragged the heavy rug aside, revealing a small trap door. Get in, I ordered. But Dad, what about you? She asked, hesitating. I stood up and buttoned my tuxedo jacket. I am going to open the door and invite them in for a drink, I said. I need to buy us time, and I need to look that sheriff in the eye. I know Sheriff Miller. He is a good man, but he is being fed a lie. The screech of tires on gravel outside was deafening. A loudspeaker crackled to life. Thaddeus King, this is the sheriff's department. Come out with your hands up. We have the house surrounded. I looked at Zoe, huddled in the dark crawl space beneath the floor. Stay quiet, I whispered. No matter what you hear, do not make a sound. I closed the trap door and kicked the rug back in place. I took a deep breath, smoothed my tie, and walked toward the front door. The lion was in the den, and the hyenas were at the door. It was time to see who had the sharper teeth. I opened the heavy oak door and stood there in my tuxedo like a butler waiting for guests. Sheriff Jim Miller was standing on the porch, his hand resting instinctively on his holster, but his eyes were filled with confusion rather than aggression. We went way back, Jim and I. I had built the extension on his house 10 years ago, and we fished the same creek every summer. He knew I wasn't a criminal, and he certainly knew I wasn't the type to snap without a reason. Thaddeus Jim said, his voice cautious. Put your hands where I can see them. We had a report of an abduction and shots fired. I raised my empty hands, slowly showing him my palms. The calluses were the only weapon I was holding. Good evening, Jim, I said calmly, my voice steady as a rock. You know me better than that. Does this look like a hostage situation to you, or does it look like a father bringing his daughter home from a bad situation? Before Jim could answer, Connor pushed his way through the line of deputies. He deserved an Academy Award for the performance he was giving. He rushed past the officers, his face contorted in fake anguish and his tie loosened just enough to look distressed. He has a gun, Sheriff Connor shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. He is armed and dangerous. He dragged her out of the church. He is confused, Sheriff. He has early onset dementia. He doesn't know who I am or where he is. You need to subdue him before he hurts Zoe. I watched him lie. It was impressive in a sickening way. He was painting a picture of me as a senile, violent old man stripping away my dignity with every word. The young deputies looked nervous, their hands tightening on their weapons, ready to take down the crazy old black man at the slightest provocation. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout back. I simply stepped aside and gestured to the living room where the warm light of the kerosene lamp was still flickering. "There is no need for violence," I said, looking straight at Jim. "Come inside, Sheriff. You can ask Zoe yourself." Jim hesitated for a second, then nodded to his men to lower their weapons. He stepped across the threshold, bringing the smell of rain and tension with him. Connor followed close behind his eyes, scanning the room like a shark looking for blood. "Zoe," I called out softly. "Come here, baby girl." Zoe walked out from the shadows of the hallway. The sight of her silenced the room. Her expensive wedding dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud. Her makeup was ruined, but her head was high. She walked past the deputies and came to stand right next to me, slipping her hand into mine. Sheriff Miller looked at her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you being held against your will? Did your father force you to leave the Ritz-Carlton?" Connor stepped forward before she could speak, trying to control the narrative. "Zoe, darling, don't be afraid. The police are here now. They can take him to a hospital. Just tell them he threatened you." Zoe looked at Connor. For the first time all night, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else. Disgust. She looked at the sheriff. "I am not a hostage," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I am here because I want to be. My father saved me. The only person I am afraid of is standing right there wearing a groom's suit." The air in the room shifted instantly. The deputies relaxed their stances. Sheriff Miller looked at Connor, and I saw the suspicion taking root in his eyes. "Well, Mr. Sterling," the sheriff drawled, hitching up his belt, "it seems we have a misunderstanding. If the lady says she wasn't kidnapped, then there is no crime here. This looks like a domestic dispute, and I am not in the business of arresting fathers for taking care of their daughters." I felt a surge of triumph. Connor's kidnapping narrative had crumbled. He had played his ace and lost. But I underestimated him. I underestimated just how deep his plan went. Connor's expression changed instantly. The grieving panic vanished. The mask of the distraught lover fell away, revealing the cold, calculating face of a businessman who had just encountered a minor setback. He straightened his jacket and smoothed his hair. "Fine," he said, his voice dropping an octave devoid of any emotion. "Drop the kidnapping charges. It is a waste of time anyway." He reached into his inner pocket. I tensed, ready for a weapon, but he pulled out a folded document. It was legal paper, thick and creamy. "If this isn't a criminal matter, Sheriff, then it is a civil one," Connor said, unfolding the paper with a sharp snap. "And I am afraid Mr. King and his daughter have a very expensive problem on their hands." He walked over to the dining table and slammed the paper down next to the bottle of bourbon. "What is this?" I asked, eyeing the document. "It is a prenuptial agreement," Connor said, smiling that shark smile again. "Zoe signed it 3 days ago." I looked at Zoe. She went pale and looked down at the floor. "He made me dad," she whispered. "He said he wouldn't marry me without it. He said it was just to protect his family's trust fund." I didn't read the fine print. Connor tapped the paper with his index finger. Clause 17, Section B, he recited as if he had memorized it. "In the event that the wedding is canceled or annulled by the bride or her family after the rehearsal dinner has concluded, the bride agrees to reimburse the groom for all wedding expenses, emotional distress, and reputational damage." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And there is a liquidation clause," Connor added, his eyes locking onto mine. "A fixed penalty. $5 million. Payable immediately." The room went dead silent. $5 million. It was an impossible number. It was more than the ranch was worth. It was more than I had made in a lifetime of construction. Sheriff Miller let out a low whistle. "Son, that is a hell of a contract," he muttered. "It is ironclad," Connor said smugly. "My lawyers drafted it, and your daughter signed it in front of a notary. So here is the deal, Thaddeus. You can kick me out. You can play the tough guy. But if you do, I will sue you for everything you have. I will take this house. I will take this land. I will take every truck in your fleet. I will leave you destitute, sleeping under a bridge in the city you helped build." He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine. Or he whispered, Zoe comes back to the car with me right now. We go to the justice of the peace tomorrow and make this legal. She signs the deed to the ranch over to me as a wedding gift. And this contract disappears. It was blackmail, plain and simple. He was using the legal system as a weapon, holding a gun to my head that the sheriff couldn't see. Zoe was sobbing quietly. "Dad, I am so sorry," she cried. "I didn't know. I didn't know." I looked at the paper. I looked at Connor's smug face. He thought he had won. He thought that because he had a piece of paper and a suit, he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could bully Thaddeus King. I let go of Zoe's hand and picked up the contract. It felt heavy in my hands. "Is this the original?" I asked quietly. Connor laughed. "Of course not. The original is in my lawyer's safe. That is just a copy. Tear it up if you want. It won't change a thing." I looked him in the eye. "You think this is about money, boy," I said. "You think you can put a price tag on my flesh and blood. You think $5 million is enough to make me sell my daughter to a devil like you." I didn't wait for an answer. I gripped the paper with both hands. "I don't care about your lawyers," I growled. "I don't care about your money, and I certainly don't care about your threats." I ripped the paper in half. The sound was loud and satisfying in the quiet room. Then I ripped it again, and again, until the $5 million threat was nothing but confetti raining down onto the floorboards. Connor's smile faltered. "You are making a mistake," he hissed. "You are choosing poverty. You are choosing ruin." "No," I said, stepping forward, forcing him to take a step back. "I am choosing war." I pointed a calloused finger at his chest. "You get off my property, Connor. You take your deputies and your threats and you get the hell out of my house. If you want to sue me, go ahead. Send your lawyers, send your judge, send the whole damn army. But if you ever come near my daughter again, I won't need a contract to finish you." Connor looked at the sheriff, waiting for him to intervene, but Jim just crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling. "Mr. King has asked you to leave his property," Mr. Sterling, Jim said casually. "And since there is no active warrant, I suggest you do so, unless you want me to write you up for trespassing." Connor's face turned a shade of purple I hadn't seen before. He glared at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, old man," he spat. "You have until morning. If she isn't back by then, I will bury you." He spun on his heel and stormed out the door. I watched the taillights of his car disappear into the night, followed by the sheriff's cruisers. The silence returned to the cabin, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I turned to Zoe, who was looking at the shredded paper on the floor. "Dad," she whispered, $5 million. We don't have that kind of money. We are going to lose everything." I walked over to the fireplace and threw a log onto the dying embers. The sparks flew up, illuminating the determination on my face. "We aren't going to lose anything, baby girl," I said, watching the fire catch. "He wants a fight, he is going to get one. He thinks he is fighting a poor old man. He doesn't know he just declared war on a soldier." I picked up my phone. It was time to make a call. I needed backup. I needed someone who knew how to fight in the shadows. "Get some sleep, Zoe," I said. "Tomorrow we go on the offensive." I dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice picked up. "Hello, Thaddeus," the voice said. "I was wondering when you would call." "I need a favor, Marcus," I said. "A big one." I stood there in the dim light, the phone pressed to my ear, planning the destruction of Connor Sterling. The note in the bouquet had been a plea for help. My answer was going to be a revolution. I woke up the next morning with a plan of attack, but the enemy had moved while I was sleeping. I drove the old Ford truck to the gas station at the edge of town, intending to fill up the tank and buy supplies for a siege. We needed canned food, water, and ammunition. I walked up to the counter and slid my debit card into the reader. Declined. I frowned and wiped the chip on my flannel shirt, thinking it was just a smudge of grease. I inserted it again. Declined. The young clerk popped his gum and looked at me with bored eyes. "It says, call your bank pops." I walked out to the truck, my heart hammering a warning rhythm against my ribs. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the back of the card. After 10 minutes of elevator music, a woman with a voice like a robot answered. "Mr. King," she said coolly, "we have frozen your accounts due to suspicious activity. We received a notification of irregular withdrawals and potential identity theft. I gripped the phone so hard I thought the plastic would crack. Who reported it? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. A Mr. Connor Sterling, the woman replied. He is listed as a secondary contact on your daughter's joint account, which is linked to yours. He claimed you were acting erratically and might be under duress. For your protection, we have locked everything until you can appear in person with a court-appointed guardian. I hung up. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. I just sat there in the cab of my truck staring at the fuel gauge that was hovering near empty. Connor wasn't just coming for my land. He was trying to starve us out. He was using the system, the very system I had paid taxes into for 50 years, to strangle me. He wanted me penniless, powerless, and begging. He had forgotten one thing. You don't need a credit card to buy loyalty. I looked at Zoe, who was sleeping fitfully against the passenger window. I started the truck, praying the fumes in the tank would last another 20 miles. I wasn't going to the bank. I was going to the one place in Atlanta where Connor Sterling's money couldn't reach. We drove south, away from the manicured lawns of the suburbs and into the tangled streets of the old industrial district. This was where I started. This was where the real work happened. I pulled up behind a nondescript electronics repair shop with barred windows. "Wake up, baby girl," I said gently. "We are here." Zoe rubbed her eyes, looking at the peeling paint on the building. "Who lives here, Dad?" "Family," I said. "Not by blood, but by bond." I knocked on the steel door 3 times, then paused and knocked twice more. A moment later, the heavy bolts slid back. A man filled the doorway. He was 40 years old, with dreadlocks tied back and a face that had seen too much. "Uncle Thad," the man said, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Marcus," I said, stepping forward to hug him. "I need your help, son. And I don't have a dime to pay you." Marcus looked at Zoe, then back at me. He saw the look in my eyes, the look that said I was cornered. "My pops didn't charge you when he took that shrapnel for you in the Mekong Delta," Marcus said, stepping aside. "You don't pay here. Get inside." Marcus was a ghost. To the world, he was a small-time repairman fixing cracked phone screens. But I knew the truth. Marcus was a wizard with code. He was what they called a gray hat hacker. He walked the line between legal and illegal, and right now I needed him to cross it. We sat in his back room, surrounded by humming servers and glowing monitors. I told him everything: the wedding, the note, the fake accident, the frozen accounts. Marcus listened without blinking. When I finished, he spun his chair around to face his main rig. "So, he wants the ranch." Marcus mused, his fingers already flying across a mechanical keyboard. "He wants it bad enough to frame a girl and freeze an old man's life savings. That doesn't make sense, Thad." I checked the zoning maps. That land is designated agricultural. You can't build condos on it. You can't put a strip mall there. I leaned against the desk, watching the lines of code cascade down the screen like green rain. "My wife Beatrice used to say that land was a gold mine," I said softly, the memory washing over me. Zoe looked up from the corner where she was drinking a soda Marcus had given her. "Mom said that." I nodded. Every evening she would sit on the porch in her rocking chair, looking out over the valley as the sun went down. She would take a deep breath of that clean air and say, "Thaddeus, we are sitting on a treasure. One day this land is going to take care of our grandchildren." I always thought she was speaking metaphorically. I continued, my voice thick with emotion. I thought she meant the peace, the quiet, the freedom of owning your own dirt. But Beatrice was smarter than me. She read everything: geology reports, county surveys, history books. Maybe she knew something we didn't. Marcus stopped typing. He hit a key with a flourish. "Well, let's see what Mr. Sterling knows," Marcus said. "If he is this desperate, he has left a digital trail. Guys like him are arrogant. They think encryption is magic. They don't realize that a password is only as strong as the person using it." On the screen, a window popped up. It was Connor's private email server. "I am in," Marcus said. "Let's search for keywords: ranch, land, king." Nothing came up that we didn't already know. Just standard legal drafts and the prenup I had torn up. "Dig deeper, Marcus," I urged. "Look at his financials. Look at his debts. A man doesn't risk a kidnapping charge for a retirement plan. He does it because he is running from something." Marcus switched windows. He hacked into Connor's offshore accounts. The screen flashed red. "Whoa," Marcus whispered, leaning in. "This guy isn't rich, Thad. He is bleeding." What do you mean? Zoe asked, stepping closer. He is leveraged to the hilt, Marcus explained, pointing at the negative numbers. He has been playing high-stakes venture capital with money he doesn't have. He bet big on a tech startup last year that went bust. He lost everything. But the cars, the clothes, Zoe stammered. Leased, Marcus said. Rented, borrowed, it is all a facade. But that is not the worst part. Look at this. He pulled up a series of encrypted emails from a sender with no name, just a string of numbers. The subject lines were in Russian, but the attachments were clear. They were photos. Photos of Connor walking to his car. Photos of Connor's parents. And one photo of Zoe taken from across the street a week before the wedding. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Who are they? I asked. Loan sharks. Marcus said, his face grim. But not the local kind. These are Bratva, Russian organized crime. Connor borrowed $10 million from them to cover his losses, hoping to flip a big deal and pay them back before they noticed. The deal fell through, I realized. Exactly, Marcus said, opening the latest email. It was dated yesterday morning, hours before the wedding. I asked Marcus to translate it. He ran it through a program. The text appeared on the screen in stark white letters. Mr. Sterling, your time is up. We do not accept excuses. We accept payment. $10 million by next Friday, or we take payment in blood. We will start with the girl, then your parents, then you. The room fell silent. The only sound was the hum of the cooling fans. It all made sense now. The rush to get married, the obsession with the deed, the desperation. Connor wasn't trying to build a fortune. He was trying to save his life. He needed the ranch because he had found a buyer who would pay enough to clear his debt with the Russians. He was going to sell my legacy to save his own skin. He is a dead man walking, I said quietly, and he is trying to use you as a human shield, Marcus added. That is why he froze your accounts. He needs to break you fast. He has less than a week, Thad. If he doesn't get that deed by Friday, the Russians will kill him. Zoe let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. He was going to give me to them, she cried. If he couldn't pay, he was going to let them take me. I put my arm around her, holding her tight. The anger in my chest was a physical weight, now hot and heavy. No, I said. He isn't going to take anyone. I looked at Marcus. Can you print that email? Can you get me the names of the Russians? Marcus nodded. I can do better. I can trace their burner phones. I can tell you where they are operating from. But Thad, these aren't street thugs. These are professionals. I am not a street thug either, I said, staring at the screen where Connor's life was unraveling in ones and zeros. I turned to Zoe. We aren't going back to the ranch to hide, I told her. We are going back to set a trap. Connor is desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. He has brought wolves to our doorstep expecting sheep. I clenched my fist, feeling the strength that had built skyscrapers and survived jungles. He is about to find out that he just walked into a bear's den. Marcus, hand me that phone, I said, pointing to a burner on his desk. I have a call to make. Not to Connor, but to the men holding his leash. The cliffhanger hung in the air like smoke. I knew what I had to do. I was going to contact the Russian mob. I was going to invite them to the party. Because if Connor wanted a war, I would give him a world war. The drive back from Marcus's place was quiet, but it was the silence of a bomb squad technician cutting a wire, not the silence of peace. I kept checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds, looking for taillights that didn't belong or a car that stayed too close for too long. Zoe sat next to me, clutching a bag of burner phones and a hard drive that contained the digital soul of Connor Sterling. We had the information, but information doesn't stop a bullet, and I knew that once the sun went down, the rules of engagement would change. We pulled up to the main house just as the last light of day was bleeding out of the sky, turning the clouds a bruised purple. The ranch looked the same as it always did, sturdy and welcoming, but now it felt fragile. I parked the truck around the back near the machine shed, hidden from the main road. I told Zoe to get inside and lock the door while I did a perimeter check. I was halfway to the porch when the first strike happened. There was no warning, no sound of a car engine. Just the whistle of something heavy cutting through the air, followed by the sickening sound of shattering glass. The front bay window, the one my wife Beatrice had loved because it caught the morning sun, exploded inward. Dad, Zoe screamed from inside. I hit the dirt, rolling instinctively toward the cover of the woodpile. I scanned the tree line, my hand gripping the .38 in my pocket. Nothing. No movement, no muzzle flash, just the swaying of the pines in the wind. I waited a full minute, counting the seconds by the thumping of my own heart. When I was sure no follow-up shots were coming, I ran inside, keeping low. Zoe was huddled in the kitchen hallway, shaking. Glass was everywhere, glittering on the hardwood floor like diamonds from hell. Lying in the middle of the living room rug was a brick wrapped in duct tape. I walked over and picked it up. It was heavy, cold, and ugly. There was no note attached. The brick was the message. It said, "We can touch you." It said, "Your walls are thin." I looked at Zoe. Her face was pale, but she wasn't crying anymore. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the same cold anger that was burning in my gut. "Get the broom," I said quietly. "Clean up the glass." "Dad, we should call the sheriff," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And tell him what I asked, walking to the window and looking out into the darkness. That a brick broke a window. He will file a report. He might send a patrol car to drive by once an hour. But a patrol car can't stop a bullet, Zoe, and Connor knows that. This wasn't Connor. This was the Russians. They are testing our defenses. They want to see if we will run." I turned to her. "I am not running." I went out to the machine shed and fired up the generator. I didn't turn on the house lights that would just make us targets. I turned on the floodlights I had installed on the barn roof years ago, pointing them outward toward the tree line. The yard was instantly bathed in harsh white light, creating a perimeter that no one could cross unseen. Then I went to work. I spent the next 3 hours turning my home into a fortress. I dragged sheets of 3/4-inch plywood from the workshop and screwed them over the windows. I used 4-inch deck screws, driving them deep into the studs. The sound of the impact driver was loud and aggressive, a mechanical growl that echoed through the empty house. Zoe helped me. She held the sheets of wood, her hands steadying the heavy timber. We worked in silence, a father and daughter, preparing for a siege. When the last window was covered, the house felt smaller, darker, but safer. It was no longer a home, it was a bunker. We sat in the kitchen, lit only by a single lantern. I placed a long, heavy case on the table and unzipped it. The smell of gun oil filled the room, sharp and metallic. I pulled out my Mossberg pump-action shotgun. It was old, scratched, and well used, but the action was smooth as silk. "Do you know how to use this?" I asked Zoe. She shook her head, eyeing the black metal with fear. "You know I hate guns, Dad. Mom hated them too." "Your mother hated violence," I corrected her, sliding a shell into the magazine tube. "But she loved survival. And right now, this is the only thing standing between us and men who don't care about your morals." I stood up. "Come with me." We went down to the basement. The walls were thick concrete, soundproof enough for what we needed to do. I set up a row of empty paint cans at the far end of the room. I handed her the shotgun. It was heavy in her hands. She looked awkward, holding it like it was a venomous snake that might bite her. "It is not a magic wand, Zoe," I said, stepping behind her, adjusting her stance. "It is a tool, just like a hammer or a drill. Lean into it. Keep your cheek on the stock. If you lean back, it will knock you over. If you lean forward, you control it." I guided her hands, showing her how to pump the action. The sound was distinct. Chuck-chick. It was the universal sound of, "Do not come any closer. Aim at the middle," I said. "Can. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Just a gentle pressure." She took a deep breath. I saw her knuckles turn white. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. She squeezed. Boom! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The paint can flew backwards, spinning through the air. Zoe stumbled back a step from the recoil, but she didn't drop the weapon. She looked at the can, then at the gun, then at me. "Again," I said. "We spent an hour down there." By the time we came back upstairs, her shoulder was bruised and her ears were ringing, but her eyes were different. The victim was gone. In her place was someone who knew she could bite back. We were sitting in the kitchen drinking instant coffee when the burner phone on the table buzzed. I looked at the caller ID. It was blocked. I picked it up and put it on speaker. "Hello, Connor," I said, my voice flat. There was a pause. I could hear heavy breathing on the other end and the sound of traffic. "You need to sell the land," Thaddeus Connor said. His voice wasn't the smooth, arrogant baritone from the wedding. It was jagged, high-pitched, and bordering on hysterical. "You need to sign the papers tonight. I can send a courier." I took a sip of coffee. "Is that why you threw a brick through my window, Connor?" "To expedite the paperwork." "That wasn't me," he snapped. "I told you they are watching. They know you are there. Listen to me, old man. You don't understand who you are dealing with. These people don't file lawsuits. They don't negotiate. They are animals." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "They gave me a deadline, Thaddeus. But they are getting impatient. If I don't give them the deed by tomorrow morning, they said they are going to accelerate the timeline. They said accidents happen on farms all the time. Fires, gas leaks, stray bullets." I looked at the plywood covering the windows. "Let them come," I said. "And you can tell your Russian friends that the next time they step onto my property, they won't be leaving on their feet." "Thaddeus, please," Connor begged, and I realized with a jolt that he was crying. "I am a dead man if you don't do this. I will give you half the money. I will give you anything. Just sign the damn paper." "You made your bed, Connor," I said. "Now you have to sleep in it." I hung up and pulled the battery out of the phone. "He is terrified," Zoe said quietly. "Good," I said. "Fear makes people sloppy." I checked my watch. It was 2 a.m. I told Zoe to try and get some sleep on the couch while I took the first watch. I sat in the rocking chair with the shotgun across my knees, listening to the wind howl outside. Around 4 a.m, a sound cut through the silence. It wasn't a brick this time. It was a sound that every rancher knows and dreads. It was the high-pitched scream of a horse in pain. I was out of the chair and out the back door in seconds. I didn't care about cover anymore. I ran toward the stables, my flashlight cutting a beam through the black night. The stable doors were open, swinging in the wind. I rushed inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of hay and manure. It was a chemical smell, sweet and acrid, like almonds and bleach. Bessie, my prize quarter horse, was on the ground, kicking her legs feebly against the stall wall. Her coat was slick with sweat, and thick white foam was dripping from her mouth. "No, no, no, no," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside her. I checked her eyes. They were rolling back in her head. Her breathing was ragged, shallow gasps. I looked around frantically. The water trough in the corner of the stall was full, but the surface had an oily sheen to it. I dipped my finger in and smelled it. The chemical stench made my eyes water. I ran to the next stall. Thunder Zoe's childhood pony was standing in the corner, trembling, his head hanging low, drool pooling on the straw. They poisoned the water. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a vice. A brick through a window was a warning. But this was an act of pure evil. Attacking helpless animals to get to me was a level of depravity I hadn't expected. I ran to the main shutoff valve for the stable water supply and cranked it closed, my hands slipping on the cold metal. I grabbed the emergency medical kit from the wall, but as I looked at Bessie, I knew it was too late. Her kicking slowed. She let out one last shuddering breath and then went still. I stood there in the dim light of the stable, surrounded by the sound of suffering animals and the smell of death. Tears stung my eyes, but they didn't fall. The grief was instantly incinerated by a white-hot rage. I heard footsteps behind me. Zoe was standing in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she looked at Bessie. "They killed them," she sobbed. "They killed the horses." I walked past her out of the stable and into the cool night air. I looked toward the main well that supplied the entire ranch. If they had dumped poison in there, the ground itself was now a weapon. I racked the slide of the shotgun. The sound echoed across the silent fields. "They didn't just kill the horses, Zoe," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "They just signed their own death warrants." Connor was right about one thing. The time for talking was over. The Russians had decided to play dirty, but they forgot that pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. And on this ranch, I was the butcher. I watched the man work under the harsh glow of the work lights in my machine shed. Dr. Eris Thorne didn't look like a scientist. He looked like a drifter who had spent too much time in the desert, which was exactly why I hired him. I didn't want a suit from a big firm. Big firms talk. They file permits. They leave paper trails that men like Connor Sterling can follow. Eris was a freelancer, a ghost geologist who mapped illegal mines in South America before retiring to a quiet life in Georgia. He owed me a favor from a time I pulled his truck out of a mudslide back in '98. He was hunched over a core sample we had drilled from the south pasture an hour ago. The dirt was dark and heavy, packed into a clear plastic tube. Eris was dripping a chemical solution onto the soil, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. Zoe sat on a stack of hay bales watching him. She looked exhausted. The circles under her eyes were dark purple, but she hadn't complained once since we started this siege. She was holding the shotgun across her lap, and for the first time it didn't look unnatural. "Thaddeus," Eris said without looking up. "Come look at this." I walked over, wiping the grease from my hands on a rag. "What is it, Eris? Did you find oil?" Eris laughed, a dry, raspy sound. "Oil! Thaddeus, oil is yesterday's news. Oil is for dinosaurs. This is the future. He pointed to the tube. The chemical had turned a section of the soil a vibrant electric violet color. I leaned in, squinting. It just looks like purple dirt to me. It is lithium aris, said his voice, dropping to a whisper. High-grade lithium brine. It is trapped in the clay layer beneath your water table. I looked at him blankly. I built skyscrapers, not batteries. I knew concrete and steel. Lithium, Zoe piped up from the hay bales. It is for batteries, Dad. Electric cars. Phones. Laptops. Aris nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. The world is desperate for this stuff, Thaddeus. The car companies are fighting wars over supply chains. China controls most of it. Finding a deposit like this on American soil, in Georgia of all places, it is a unicorn. He pulled out a spectrometer and ran it over the sample one last time. I have to run the numbers to be sure, Aris said, pushing his glasses up his nose. But based on the density and the spread of the vein, I would say you are sitting on one of the largest untapped reserves on the East Coast. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. My wife Beatrice had always said there was treasure under this land. I always thought she meant the history, the memories. I didn't know she was literally walking on a fortune. How much, I asked, not because I wanted to sell, but because I needed to know the price of the target on my back. Aris did some mental math, staring at the ceiling. If you sold the mineral rights alone, he said, not the land, just the rights to dig, you are looking at $50 million, maybe 60 if you start a bidding war. $50 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Zoe. She gasped, covering her mouth. 50 million, she whispered. Connor knew. I slammed my hand down on the workbench, making the tools jump. Of course he knew. It all fell into place. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a sledgehammer. Connor wasn't in debt to the Russians because he was a bad gambler. He was in debt because he had leveraged everything to buy this ranch. He had promised them the land. He probably already had a buyer lined up. A tech giant, I said, my voice cold. Or a battery manufacturer. They made a deal with him. He gets the deed, he flips the land the next day and walks away with a massive profit. And he pays off the Russians, Zoe added, and keeps the rest. He was going to steal $50 million from us, I growled, and he was going to do it by marrying you. That is why the prenup was so important. That is why he needed the land in his name. If we divorced, he would have to split the assets. But if he owned the land before the divorce, or if I died... I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. We all knew what Connor was capable of. Aris started packing up his equipment quickly. He looked nervous. He was a man who liked rocks, not conspiracies. Thaddeus, Aris said, zipping up his canvas bag. You need to be careful. People kill for a lot less than this. If a corporation is involved, they have resources you can't imagine. Private security, lawyers, fixers. I know, I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out a roll of cash. It was my emergency fund money I had buried in a coffee can in the garden years ago. Thank you, Aris, I said, handing him the money. Go home. Go underground. Don't tell anyone you were here, not even your wife. Aris took the money and nodded. I am heading to my cabin in the Smokies, he said. I will lay low for a while. You should do the same, Thaddeus. This isn't a fight you can win with a shotgun. I walked him to his car, an old beat-up station wagon parked behind the barn. The night was pitch black. The clouds had covered the moon. Be safe, Aris, I said, shaking his hand. He got in and started the engine. Watch your back, Thaddeus, he said through the open window. You are sitting on a powder keg. I watched his taillights fade down the long dirt driveway. I stood there in the dark, listening to the engine hum until it reached the main road about a mile away. I turned to go back inside. I needed to tell Marcus. We needed to find out which company was backing Connor. If we could expose the corporate deal, we could blow his plan out of the water. Then I heard it. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a screech of tires. Long, agonizing rubber burning on asphalt, followed by a sickening metallic crunch that shook the ground beneath my feet. The sound was followed by silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. No, 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 I whispered. I ran. I didn't grab the truck. I just ran. My 72-year-old legs pumping harder than they had in decades. I sprinted down the driveway, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. I reached the main road, gasping for air, my chest burning. Smoke was rising from the ditch about 100 yards down the road. I ran toward it. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber filled my nose. Eris's station wagon was upside down. It had been rammed. The entire side of the car was caved in like a crushed soda can. "Eris," I shouted, sliding down the embankment into the mud. "Eris, can you hear me?" I shined the light into the cab. The roof was collapsed. Eris was hanging from his seatbelt. He wasn't moving. There was blood everywhere. I reached in, trying to find a pulse, trying to cut the belt, but the metal was twisted too tight. Then I saw the other vehicle. It was a black SUV with a massive steel grille guard. It was parked 50 yards away, idling. Its headlights were off. It sat there like a predator in the dark. The driver's window rolled down slowly. I couldn't see the face inside. I just saw the silhouette of a man holding a phone to his ear. "It is done," the man said. His voice carried across the quiet road. "The geologist is neutralized." I froze. They had been watching. They had been watching the whole time. They knew Eris was here. They waited until he left my property line, until he was on public digging for evidence, and they took him out. The black SUV revved its engine. For a second I thought they were coming for me. I reached for the revolver in my pocket. But the driver just laughed. A cold, mechanical sound. He put the SUV in gear and peeled away, disappearing into the night, leaving me alone in the ditch with a dead man and the burning wreckage of the truth. I stood there, the rain starting to fall again, mixing with the blood and the gasoline. They didn't just want the land, they were scrubbing the board. Anyone who knew the secret was a target, and I was next. I looked back up the hill toward the ranch house where my daughter was waiting. I wasn't a builder anymore. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a man at war. And as I looked at Eris's broken body, I made a promise to the dark sky. I am not going to sue them. I am not going to report them. I am going to hunt them. The art of war is not about who has the biggest gun or the most soldiers. It is about deception. My father taught me that when I was learning to box in the back alleys of Chicago. He said, "Thaddeus, if you want to knock a big man down, you have to make him believe you are already falling. You have to let him drop his guard, let him puff out his chest, and think he has won. That is when you strike. That is when you deliver the blow that ends the fight." I put on my best suit. It was a charcoal gray three-piece I hadn't worn since Beatrice's funeral. It hung a little loose on my frame now, which was perfect for the role I was about to play. I looked in the mirror and practiced my posture. I rounded my shoulders. I let my hands tremble. I dulled the fire in my eyes until I looked exactly like what Connor Sterling wanted to see. A defeated, broken old man who had lost his will to fight. I called him at noon. I made my voice crack. I told him I was done. I told him he had won. We met at a place called the Gilded Lily downtown. It was the kind of restaurant where they charge you $20 for water and the waiters look at you like they are doing you a favor by serving you. It was Connor's turf, a place of glass and steel and pretension. I walked in, leaning heavily on my cane, dragging my left foot slightly. I saw the hostess look me up and down, her nose wrinkling as if I smelled like the barn I had just left. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you at table 12, she said, leading me through the maze of white tablecloths. Connor was already there. He was drinking a martini, his phone face down on the table. He looked tired. His eyes were bloodshot, and his suit looked like he had slept in it, but when he saw me shuffling toward him, a spark of triumph lit up his face. He sat up straighter. He adjusted his tie. He was the shark smelling blood in the water. "You look terrible," Thaddeus Connor said, not bothering to stand up to shake my hand. I sank into the chair, letting out a long, weary sigh. I didn't look him in the eye. I stared at the pristine white napkin on my lap. "You killed my horses, Connor," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You killed Bessie. You killed Thunder. And that man, that geologist." Connor took a sip of his drink. His hand didn't even shake. "I don't know what you are talking about, Thaddeus," he said smoothly, though his eyes darted around the room. "Accidents happen. It is a dangerous world out there, especially for old men who don't know when to quit." I reached into my jacket pocket. Connor flinched, thinking I was going for a gun. I saw the fear spike in his eyes for a second. Good. He was still on edge. I pulled out a folded document. It wasn't the deed. It was a preliminary agreement drafted on legal paper. "I can't fight you anymore," I said, pushing the paper across the table. "I am 72 years old. I can't sleep. My daughter is terrified. I just want it to stop. Connor picked up the paper. His greedy eyes scanned the lines. It was a promise to transfer the title of the King Legacy Ranch to him within 24 hours, provided all legal threats against Zoe were dropped. This is a good start, Connor said, a smirk curling his lip. But I need the deed, Thaddeus. The actual deed. I have it, I said, patting my other pocket. But I have conditions. Connor laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that made a few diners turn their heads. You are hardly in a position to make demands, old man. You are broke. Your accounts are frozen. Your reputation is being shredded in the press as we speak. I hold all the cards. I looked up at him, letting a single tear roll down my cheek. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was necessary. I know, I said softly. You beat me, Connor. You are smarter. You are stronger. But I am a father, and I won't sign over my legacy until I know my daughter is safe. I leaned forward, dropping my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I want you to delete the video, I said, the dash cam footage, the accident. I want you to delete every copy you have right now, right in front of me. If you do that, I will sign the deed over to you this second. Connor looked at me. He was calculating. He was weighing the risk. He looked at the document in his hand, then at the desperation on my face. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see. A man who had reached his breaking point. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim silver laptop. He opened it and logged in. You are making the right choice, Thaddeus, he said, his tone patronizing. Zoe will thank you for this. Eventually. We can still be a family, you know. Once this business is concluded. I wanted to reach across the table and wrap my hands around his throat. I wanted to smash his face into his expensive martini. But I sat still. I kept my head bowed. Show me, I said. Connor turned the laptop toward me. There it was. The video file. The file name was simply insurance. He clicked on it. The video played. I saw the rain. I saw Zoe's car. I saw the impact. And I saw Connor's face in the frame instructing her to get in his car. This is the only copy Connor asked. The only one he said. I am a man of my word, Thaddeus. Delete it, I said, and the cloud backup. Connor rolled his eyes, but he complied. He dragged the file to the trash bin. Then he emptied the trash. Then he logged into his cloud account and did the same. Gone, he said, closing the laptop with a snap. Poof, like it never happened. Now the deed. I sat back in my chair. I took a sip of water to wash the taste of bile from my mouth. Thank you, Connor, I said. You have no idea how much that means to me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the deed. Connor's eyes widened. He reached for it, his fingers twitching. I held onto it for a second longer. One more thing, I said. The debt. The Russians. Are they going to leave us alone once you pay them? Connor froze. His hand stopped in midair. How do you know about that? He whispered, his face losing some of its color. Does it matter, I asked. I just want to know that when I give you this land, the violence stops. No more bricks through windows. No more dead geologists. Connor looked around nervously. He leaned in close. Once I pay them off, they go away, he hissed. That is how it works. They just want their money, Thaddeus. I am doing this to save all of us. You should be thanking me. I nodded slowly. I let go of the deed. Connor snatched it like a starving dog snatching a bone. He checked the signature. He checked the notary stamp. It was all real. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked 10 feet tall. You did the right thing, old man, he said, tucking the deed into his breast pocket. I will have my lawyers draft the final transfer papers in the morning. Don't leave town. He threw a $100 bill on the table. Lunch is on me, he said with a wink. I watched him walk away. He had a bounce in his step. He thought he had just won the lottery. He thought he had defeated Thaddeus King. I waited until he was out the door before I looked to my left. At the table right next to us, a man in a gray business suit lowered his newspaper. He was wearing thick-rimmed glasses and had a hearing aid in his left ear. Marcus took off the glasses and pulled the hearing aid out. It wasn't a hearing aid. It was a high-fidelity directional microphone. Did you get it? I asked, pouring myself a glass of wine. Marcus smiled and tapped the digital recorder sitting next to his coffee cup. Every word Marcus said, the blackmail, the admission of the accident, the confirmation of the Russian debt, and the threat about the geologist. It is all here, Thad, in high definition. I looked at the empty chair where Connor had sat. He had his deed, he had his victory lap, but he had just confessed to multiple felonies to a federal witness. "Send a copy to the Cloud," I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. The weight was gone from my shoulders. The act was over. "And Marcus," I added, as we walked toward the exit, "send a copy to the Russians, too. I think they might be interested to know that their partner is planning to cut ties with them." Marcus laughed. "You are a cold man, Thaddeus King." I pushed open the doors of the restaurant, stepping out into the bright Atlanta sun. "I am not cold," I said, adjusting my hat. "I am just a father who keeps his promises. Connor had the deed, but we had the truth. And tomorrow, when he tried to cash in that chip, he was going to find out that the game was rigged from the start." But as I walked to my truck, my phone buzzed. It was Zoe. "Dad," she said, her voice frantic. "You need to come back to the motel, now." "What is it?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "It is the news," she said. "Connor didn't just take the deed. He just announced a press conference. He is selling the land today, Dad, right now, to a company called Cobalt Corp." I swore under my breath. He was moving faster than we predicted. He wasn't waiting for the ink to dry. He was dumping the asset immediately. "If he sells it to a third party before we can file the injunction, we lose the land forever," I said, slamming the truck door. "We have to stop that press conference." I started the engine. The psychological war was over. Now it was a race, and I had 20 minutes to cross town before my legacy was turned into a strip mine. The meeting point was an abandoned concrete plant down by the river. It was fitting. I had poured the foundation for this place 30 years ago when the city was booming, and now it was just a graveyard of rusted hoppers and silent conveyor belts. It was a place where things went to be forgotten. Connor chose it because he thought it was secluded. I agreed to it because I knew the acoustics. If a gun went off down here, nobody would hear it but the rats. I arrived 10 minutes early. I parked the truck behind a crumbling retaining wall and checked my phone. Marcus sent a green thumbs-up emoji. The trap was set. The bait was in my pocket. All I had to do was lure the wolf into the cage. Connor pulled up in his sleek black sedan tires, crunching over the broken glass and gravel. He stepped out looking out of place in his tailored navy suit and Italian loafers. He looked around nervously, checking the shadows. He was still spooked by the Russians, but the greed in his eyes was burning brighter than his fear. He saw me standing by the old way station and walked over, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. "Do you have it?" Connor called out, his voice echoing off the concrete silos. I nodded slowly, tapping my chest pocket. The deed, not a copy. The original notarized document that transferred ownership of the King Legacy Ranch to one Connor Sterling. It felt heavy against my heart, like I was carrying a stone from my own tombstone. "And the drive?" I asked, keeping my hands where he could see them. Connor patted his jacket pocket. "Right here. The original USB, plus the cloud access codes. Once we make the trade, I walk away, and you never see me again." He stopped 5 feet away from me. The river churned sluggishly behind us, smelling of oil and mud. "Let's do this, Thaddeus," he said, holding out his hand. "I have a schedule to keep." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the deed. I held it tight. My knuckles turned ash gray. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations," I said, my voice low and rough. "My grandfather bought it with money he saved from picking cotton. My father defended it with a shotgun during the riots. I built a life on it." Connor rolled his eyes, checking his expensive watch. "Save the history lesson for the memoir, old man. It is just dirt. And right now that dirt is the only thing keeping your daughter out of a 6x8 cell." He was right. I hated him for it, but he was right. I stepped forward and held out the paper. Connor snatched it. At the same moment, he tossed me a small silver thumb drive. I caught it. It felt light, too light to hold so much destruction. "Pleasure doing business with you," Thaddeus, Connor said, grinning as he unfolded the deed, checking the signatures. "Looks like everything is in order." "Not yet," I said. I pulled a ruggedized tablet from my coat. "I need to verify the files," I said. "I need to make sure you didn't leave a backup copy tucked away in some hidden folder." Connor scoffed, but he didn't stop me. "Go ahead. You won't find anything. I told you I deleted the backups at lunch. That drive is the only copy left." I plugged the USB into the tablet. The screen flickered. This wasn't just a verification. This was the second phase of Marcus's plan. The drive Connor had given me was likely real, but the moment I plugged it into a network device, Marcus had programmed a sleeper signal. But what Connor didn't know was that I wasn't just checking the files. I was broadcasting. I tapped the screen. The files opened. There was the video, the rain, the crash, my daughter's terrified face. "It is all there," I said, looking up. "Good," Connor said, turning to leave. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a sale to close." "Wait," I said. I turned the tablet around so he could see the screen. Something was happening. The video file wasn't playing anymore. Instead, the screen was filling with lines of cascading red code. "What is that?" Connor asked, stepping closer, his brow furrowing. "That I said is a little gift from my friend Marcus. You see, Connor, when you plugged that drive into your laptop at the restaurant earlier to show me the video, you didn't just delete a file. You opened a door." Connor's eyes widened. "Marcus planted a worm," I explained calmly. "It has been dormant in your system for 3 hours, but when I plugged this drive in just now, it completed the circuit. Right now, that worm is eating through your entire digital life, your cloud backups, your email archives, your offshore accounts, and most importantly, any other copies of this video you thought you had hidden." Connor scrambled for his phone. He tapped the screen frantically. "No, no, no," he stammered. "Gone," I said. "It is all gone, Connor. The blackmail, the leverage, the proof. You have nothing." I ripped the deed in half, then in half again. I let the pieces fall into the mud at our feet, and neither do I. I took a step toward him. The anger I had been suppressing for days finally broke the surface. I felt 10 years younger. I felt the strength of the ironworker returning to my limbs. "It is over, son," I growled. "You are done. You don't have the land. You don't have the girl. And you have about 24 hours before the Russians realize you lied to them." I expected him to run. I expected him to collapse. I expected the coward I had seen at the restaurant to beg for mercy. But Connor Sterling didn't run. He started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle in his throat and grew into a manic, high-pitched cackle that bounced off the concrete walls. He laughed until he was doubling over, clutching his knees. I stopped. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't the reaction of a beaten man. This was the reaction of a man who held a joker in a deck of aces. "You old fool," Connor wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "You arrogant, senile old fool." He straightened up. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a look of pure, cold hatred. He reached behind his back. I tensed, preparing to rush him, but I was too slow. He pulled out a gun. It wasn't a small holdout piece. It was a matte black Glock service pistol. He leveled it at my chest. The muzzle looked like a cannon tunnel. "Did you really think I was that stupid?" he asked, his voice steady, now terrifyingly calm. "Did you really think I would walk into a meeting with you and not have an insurance policy?" He took a step forward, kicking the torn pieces of the deed into the dirt. "I knew you were up to something," Connor said. "You were too quiet at lunch, too submissive. So I made a contingency plan." He pulled out his phone with his free hand, keeping the gun trained on my heart. He tapped the screen. "Look at this," he said, holding it up. It was an email client, a drafted email. The recipient was the Fulton County District Attorney. The subject line read, "Evidence Vehicular Manslaughter, Zoe King." Attached to the email was the video file. I didn't keep the copy on my cloud. Thaddeus Connor sneered. "I sent it to a dead-drop server in Switzerland 3 days ago, and I set a timer." He turned the phone screen toward me so I could see the countdown, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. "If I don't enter a cancellation code into this app in the next 4 minutes, that email gets sent automatically," Connor explained. "It goes to the DA. It goes to the news stations. It goes to the police. Even if you shoot me, even if your hacker friend wipes every server in America, he can't stop that server in Zurich." I felt the blood drain from my face. My knees felt weak. He had me. He had anticipated the trap, and he had built a trap of his own. "You have a choice," Thaddeus Connor said, aiming the gun at my head. "You can stand there and watch the clock run out. You can watch your daughter go to prison for 10 years. Or you can fix this." How I whispered. The word tasted like ash. Connor reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document. It was a fresh copy of the deed. "Sign it," he ordered. "Sign it now. And then you are going to call your hacker friend and tell him to reverse whatever he just did to my accounts." I looked at the gun. I looked at the countdown on the phone. 3 minutes. If I sign that I said my voice hoarse, you win. You sell the land, you destroy my home. And if you don't—" Connor interrupted, cocking the gun. "Your daughter's life is over. She goes to prison, and you die right here in this mud." And I take the land anyway through probate court. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. I looked at his eyes. There was no humanity left in them. He was cornered, desperate and armed. He would do it. He would pull the trigger, and he would let that email fly. I thought about Zoe. I thought about her laugh. I thought about the promise I made to Beatrice on her deathbed that I would always protect our little girl. Sometimes you have to lose the battle to survive the war. I lowered my head. "Give me the pen," I said. Connor smiled. It was the smile of the devil himself. "Wise choice, Dad," he mocked. He tossed a pen at my feet. I knelt down in the mud to pick it up. My hand was shaking not from fear but from a rage so intense it felt like it was burning my veins from the inside out. I stood up. I took the fresh deed. I pressed it against the rusted metal of the conveyor belt. 1 minute left, Connor warned, checking the timer. "Don't try anything cute. Just sign your name." I put the pen to the paper. I felt like I was signing my own death warrant. But as the ink flowed as I carved my name, Thaddeus Washington King, onto the line that would strip me of my legacy, I realized something. Land is just dirt. A house is just wood. But a daughter is a life. I signed it. I handed the paper to him. "Cancel the email." I said, my voice dead. Connor checked the signature. He nodded, satisfied. He tapped a code into his phone. The timer stopped at 30 seconds. "Sent to trash," he said, showing me the screen. He tucked the deed into his pocket and kept the gun pointed at me as he backed toward his car. "Yes," he called out, opening the car door. "You really should learn to quit while you are behind." He got in and sped away, leaving me standing alone in the ruins of the concrete plant. I watched him go. I had lost. I had handed over the keys to the kingdom. But as the dust settled, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed Marcus. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Loud and clear. Marcus replied, his voice grim. "He has a dead man switch." "Yeah," I said, watching the river flow. "He won this round, Marcus. But he made a mistake." "What mistake?" Marcus asked. "He left me alive," I said. I walked back to my truck. I didn't have the deed anymore. I didn't have the leverage. But I knew where he was going. He was going to the ranch. He was going to bring his Russian friends to show off his new prize. And that was exactly where I wanted them. I wasn't going to fight him in the courts anymore. I wasn't going to fight him with computers. I reached under the seat of my truck and pulled out a heavy canvas roll. I unrolled it, revealing the tools of my trade. Not hammers and saws, but the tools from a life I had left behind in the jungle 50 years ago. Tripwire, flares, and a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. Connor thought he bought a farm. I slammed the truck door. He just bought a battlefield. The hardest part was not signing the deed. The hardest part was not walking away from the river with Connor's laughter echoing off the concrete walls. The hardest part was watching the iron gate of the King Legacy Ranch close in the rearview mirror, knowing I didn't have the key to open it anymore. We drove in silence. The old Ford truck felt heavy, as if it was carrying the weight of my failure. Zoe was curled up in the passenger seat, her knees pulled to her chest, sobbing quietly. Every few miles she would whisper, "I am sorry, Dad. I am so sorry." I didn't say anything. I just reached over and squeezed her shoulder, keeping my eyes on the road. There was nothing to say. Not yet. We didn't go to a friend's house. I didn't want anyone to see us like this. We checked into the Starlight Motel, a rundown strip of rooms on the outskirts of Atlanta where the neon sign flickered and the air smelled of diesel fumes and stale cigarettes. It was the kind of place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. I paid cash for a room with 2 double beds. The carpet was stained and the wallpaper was peeling, but it had a lock on the door and thick curtains. That was all we needed. A bunker. Zoe sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the blank television screen. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked broken. "We lost everything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mom's garden, the stable, the house you built with your own hands. Connor is going to destroy it all, Dad. And it is my fault, because I was too weak to stand up to him, because I was scared." I walked over to the window and peered through the crack in the curtains. I was watching for tails. Connor had won the battle, but I knew he wouldn't stop watching us until he felt completely safe. "You didn't lose anything, Zoe," I said, turning to face her. "A house is just wood and stone. It can be rebuilt, but you can't rebuild a life spent in prison. I did what a father is supposed to do. I protected my child. But the legacy," she cried. "The lithium, the $50 million. He took it all. He is going to win, Dad. He is going to be rich and powerful, and we are going to be this. She gestured around the dingy room at the flickering lamp and the water-stained ceiling. I didn't answer her immediately. I walked over to the small round table in the corner and turned on the television. I flipped through the channels until I found the local news. I knew Connor. I knew his ego. He wouldn't just take the land quietly. He would want the world to know he was the king, and there he was. Breaking news flashed across the bottom of the screen. The headline read, "Local entrepreneur uncovers massive lithium deposit." The camera showed Connor standing in front of my house. My house. He was wearing a hard hat and a bright orange vest surrounded by men in suits. The logo of Cobalt Corp was plastered on a banner behind him. I am proud to announce Connor was saying to a cluster of microphones that Sterling Ventures has acquired this prime property to help fuel America's green energy future. We are moving immediately to prepare the site for extraction. This is a great day for Georgia. Zoe gasped, covering her mouth. He is on the porch, she whimpered. He is standing right where Mom used to drink her tea. The camera panned out. Behind Connor, giant yellow bulldozers were already lined up. They looked like mechanical monsters waiting to feed. As we watched, the lead bulldozer revved its engine. Black smoke belched into the air. The operator lifted the massive steel blade and drove forward. I watched as the machine tore into the front porch. The wood splintered like matchsticks. The swing where I had rocked Zoe to sleep as a baby was crushed in an instant. The flower beds Beatrice had planted were churned into mud. No! Zoe screamed, lunging toward the TV as if she could stop it. "Make them stop, Dad. Please make them stop." I caught her by the arms, holding her back. She collapsed against me, weeping uncontrollably. We stood there in the flickering blue light of the motel room, watching our past being erased by a man who saw nothing but dollar signs. I watched until the roof collapsed. I watched until the front wall gave way, exposing the living room to the open air. I saw the fireplace where we hung stockings at Christmas crumble into dust. Then I reached out and turned off the TV. The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioner and Zoe's jagged breathing. "Wash your face, baby girl," I said, my voice calm. "Get some rest. You look like you went 12 rounds with a heavyweight." Zoe looked at me with confusion. "How can you be so calm?" she asked, wiping her eyes. "He just destroyed your life work. He just erased us. Why aren't you screaming? Why aren't you breaking things?" I didn't answer. I walked over to my duffel bag and pulled out a small leather kit. I sat down on the edge of the bed and took off my dress shoes. They were scuffed from the gravel at the concrete plant and muddy from the riverbank. I opened the tin of wax. The smell of polish filled the room, masking the scent of stale smoke. I took out the horsehair brush. I started to polish. Swish, swish, swish. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic. It was something I had done every night in the Army. No matter how bad the patrol was, no matter how many men we lost, you polished your boots. It was about order. It was about discipline. It was about reminding yourself that you were still in control of something, even if it was just the leather on your feet. "Dad," Zoe said, sitting up. "Did you hear me? He won." I stopped brushing. I looked at the shoe gleaming in the dim light. "Do you remember when I taught you to play chess, Zoe?" I asked. "You were 8 years old. You used to cry every time I took your pawns." Zoe frowned. "What does chess have to do with this?" I picked up the rag and buffed the toe of the shoe. "You were always afraid to lose pieces," I continued. "You tried to save everyone. The knights, the bishops, the rooks. You played defensively, and that is why I always beat you." I looked her in the eye. "To win at chess, Zoe, you have to be willing to bleed. You have to be willing to put your most valuable pieces in danger to lure the opponent out of position." I put the shoe down and picked up the other one. "Connor thinks he is playing checkers," I said, applying the wax. "He jumps a piece, he takes it, he wins. He thinks because he took the house, he took the power. He thinks because he holds the deed, he holds the land. But he doesn't know the game I am playing." I started brushing again. Swish, swish, swish. Sometimes, I said, my voice dropping to a low growl, "sometimes you have to sacrifice the queen to get the checkmate." Zoe stared at me. Her eyes widened as the realization hit her. "You let him take it," she whispered. "You wanted him to destroy the house." "I didn't want it," I said. "But I needed him to commit. I needed him to bring the heavy machinery. I needed him to sign the contract with Cobalt Corp. I needed him to dig." "Why?" she asked, breathless. "Because once he breaks ground," I said, "there is no turning back. He is committed. His money is in. The Russians are watching. Cobalt Corp is watching. He is standing on a stage with the whole world looking at him. I set the finished shoes on the floor. They shone like mirrors. And when the spotlight is brightest, I said, that is when you flip the switch. Just then, the burner phone on the table buzzed. It wasn't a text. It was a call. Zoe jumped. "Who is that?" she asked. I picked up the phone. The screen showed an unknown number. I pressed answer and put it to my ear. "Mr. King," a voice said. It wasn't Marcus. It was a deeper voice with a thick, heavy accent. It sounded like gravel tumbling down a mountain. "I am here," I said. "We are watching the news," the voice said. "Your son-in-law puts on a good show. He is destroying your home." "It is just wood," I said, staring at the blank TV screen. "Did you get the recording I sent?" "We did," the voice replied. It was very illuminating. "We do not like being lied to, Mr. King. We do not like partners who plan to cut us out. And we certainly do not like little boys who think they can play games with our money." The voice paused. "My men are in position. The investors from Cobalt Corp are on site. The bulldozers are digging. Mr. Sterling is shaking hands. He thinks he is a king." "Is everything ready on your end, Mr. King?" the voice asked. I looked at Zoe. She was watching me, holding her breath. She didn't know who was on the phone, but she saw the look on my face. It was the look of the predator, not the prey. I looked at my polished shoes. I looked at the peeling wallpaper. I thought about the porch swinging in the wind before it was crushed. I took a deep breath. "Activate it," I said. I hung up the phone. "Get your coat, Zoe," I said, standing up and putting on my jacket. "Where are we going?" she asked, scrambling to her feet. "We are going back to the ranch," I said, opening the door to the humid night air. "But Connor is there," she said. "The police are there." "Exactly," I said, smiling a cold, hard smile. "The show is about to start. And you don't want to miss the fireworks." Connor had sacrificed his humanity for a piece of land. He was about to find out that the land had a memory, and it had a grudge. We parked the truck on the ridge overlooking the valley. From up here, the destruction of my home looked like a scar on the face of the earth. The house was gone, reduced to a pile of splintered wood and broken stone. But in the center of that ruin, Connor had set up a circus. There were white tents, catered food stations, and a fleet of luxury cars parked in the mud where my garden used to be. Floodlights turned the night into day, illuminating the massive yellow drilling rig that towered over the celebration like an idol of greed. Zoe sat next to me, gripping the dashboard. She was shaking, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. She watched Connor strutting through the crowd of investors, shaking hands and laughing. He looked like a man who owned the world. He was wearing a hard hat that looked ridiculous on his manicured head, and raising a glass of champagne to the flashing cameras. "He has no idea," Zoe whispered. "No," I said, checking my watch. "He thinks he is celebrating a coronation. He doesn't know he is attending his own funeral." I picked up the binoculars. I wasn't looking at Connor. I was looking for the guests of honor. And there they were. Standing near the edge of the crowd, away from the cameras, were 4 men in dark coats. They didn't have champagne glasses. They had their hands in their pockets, and their eyes were fixed on Connor with the intensity of wolves watching a wounded deer. The man in the center was older, with a face like carved granite. That had to be the Russian contact, the man who held Connor's debt. Down below, the music stopped. Connor stepped up to a podium that had been hastily erected in front of the drilling rig. "Ladies and gentlemen," Connor's voice boomed over the speakers, echoing up to the ridge where we sat. "Thank you for joining us on this historic night. Today we don't just break ground on a mine, we break ground on the future." Beneath our feet lies one of the largest lithium deposits ever discovered in North America. And thanks to the partnership between Sterling Ventures and Cobalt Corp, we are going to power the next generation. Applause rippled through the crowd. The suits from Cobalt Corp clapped politely, but I could see them checking their phones. They wanted verification. They had bought the land based on a report Connor had provided, a report that promised billions. Now they wanted to see the color of the money. Connor turned to the drilling crew. "Gentlemen, start the extraction. Bring us up a sample of the future." The massive diesel engine of the drill roared to life, coughing black smoke into the pristine night air. The ground vibrated even up here on the ridge. The steel bit spun, biting into the earth that my family had tilled for a century. I watched Connor. He was beaming. He was looking at the Russians, nodding as if to say, "See, I told you I could deliver." The Russians didn't nod back. They just watched. The drill whined as it pushed deeper. 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet. Zoe looked at me. Dad, what if you were wrong? What if there really is lithium down there? I smiled a cold, humorless smile. There are traces, I admitted. Beatrice found them years ago. Just enough to make a Geiger counter tick. Just enough to make a greedy man lose his mind. But she also found something else. What Zoe asked. Limestone, I said. Miles and miles of porous, unstable limestone. And underneath that, the largest natural aquifer in the county. Down in the valley, the drill hit its target depth. The engine revved down. The crew engaged the winch to pull up the core sample. The crowd leaned in. This was the money shot. This was the moment Connor had destroyed my life for. The long metal tube emerged from the hole dripping with mud. The lead engineer, a man from Cobalt Corp, stepped forward with a scanner and a hammer. He unlatched the tube and cracked it open. Connor rushed over, dragging a cameraman with him. "Look at it," he shouted. "Look at the purple gold." The engineer wiped away the mud. He frowned. He wiped it again. He pulled out a chemical testing kit similar to the one Eris had used. He dropped the solution onto the soil sample. Everyone waited. Connor held his breath. The investors held their breath. The Russians took a step forward. The soil didn't turn purple. It turned a dull, muddy gray. The engineer shook his head. He took another sample from a different part of the tube. Same result. Gray. Lifeless. Worthless. He looked up at Connor. There was no microphone near him, but in the sudden silence of the valley, his voice carried. "Mr. Sterling," the engineer said, "there is nothing here." Connor laughed nervously. "What do you mean, nothing?" "Test it again. You are using the wrong solution." "I am using the industry standard, sir," the engineer said, standing up. "This is 90% limestone and clay. The lithium concentration is negligible. It is less than 0.01%. You couldn't power a wristwatch with this, let alone a car." Connor grabbed the testing kit, spilling chemicals everywhere. "Give me that. You are incompetent." He fell to his knees in the mud, frantically scrubbing at the dirt, trying to find the fortune he had been promised. "It has to be here," he screamed, his voice cracking. "The report said it was here. The geological survey said high-density brine. I saw the map." I lowered the binoculars. He saw the map I wanted him to see. I said softly to Zoe, 5 years ago, I caught a surveyor trespassing on my land. He was working for a developer. Instead of chasing him off, I made him a deal. I paid him $10,000 to file a false report in the county archives. A report that showed a massive lithium vein running right under the farmhouse. Zoe stared at me. "You planted the fake report." I nodded. I knew eventually someone would come sniffing around. I knew the world was getting hungry for resources. I wanted to know who my enemies were. I created a honeypot, Zoe. A trap for the greedy. I knew that any honest man would come to me and ask. But a dishonest man, a thief, he would steal the report and think he found a secret treasure. Connor stole the lie, I whispered, and he bet his life on it. Down below, the chaos was erupting. The CEO of Cobalt Corp was shouting at his team. The investors were rushing to their cars. But Connor wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the Russians. The 4 men in dark coats hadn't moved. They hadn't flinched. The crowd parted around them like water around a rock. Connor stood up covered in mud. He looked at the Russian boss. He held out his hands in a pleading gesture. "There is a mistake," Connor stammered. "We just missed the vein. We need to drill again. Just give me more time. I can fix this." The Russian boss didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply checked his watch, then reached into his coat pocket. Connor flinched, terrified he was about to be shot in front of 100 witnesses. But the Russian didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a phone. He made a short call. Then he turned and walked away toward his black SUV. His men followed him, leaving Connor standing alone in the spotlight. "That was the worst thing they could have done," Zoe whispered. "Why didn't they do anything?" "Because death is too easy," I said, starting the truck. "They want their money, Zoe, and now they know he can't pay. They are going to let him sweat. They are going to let him run. And then when he is tired and alone, they will collect." I put the truck in gear. "But that isn't the final nail in the coffin," I said. "What do you mean?" Zoe asked. "Even if there was lithium down there," I said, pulling onto the road. "Even if Connor was right, he still couldn't have mined it." "Why not?" "Because 10 years ago, when I found out about the aquifer, I petitioned the state. I had this entire valley designated as a protected national groundwater reserve. I looked at Zoe and smiled. It is illegal to drill, paint, or even spill oil on this land. It is a federal crime. So the deed? Zoe asked. The deed he forced you to sign. It is worthless, I said. He owns the land, yes. But he can't develop it. He can't mine it. He can't even build a condo on it because of the zoning laws I put in place. He just paid $50 million in debt for a protected nature sanctuary. We drove down the hill toward the gates. The party was dissolving into panic. Cars were honking, trying to leave. Connor was on his knees in the mud, screaming at the ground. I stopped the truck at the gate. The security guards Connor had hired were gone, having fled when the mood turned ugly. I rolled down the window. The cool night air smelled of exhaust and expensive cologne. You played the long game, Dad, Zoe said, looking back at the chaos. You knew this whole time. I reached over and took her hand. I told you, baby girl. Never play checkers with a chess master. I was willing to lose the house to save the home. I looked at the ruins of the farmhouse one last time. It hurt to see it destroyed. But I knew that Connor Sterling was feeling a pain far worse than loss. He was feeling the crushing weight of total, absolute failure. And the night wasn't over yet. The Russians were leaving, but they weren't going far. And Connor was about to find out that the only thing harder than digging for lithium is digging your own grave. Let's go, I said. We have one more stop to make. Where? Zoe asked. To the police station, I said. Because breaking federal environmental protection laws by drilling on a reserve is a felony. And I think Sheriff Miller would love to hear about the unauthorized heavy machinery on protected land. Connor thought he had taken everything from me. But as we drove away into the darkness, I knew the truth. I hadn't given him my land. I had given him a rope. And he had just kicked away the chair. We drove away from the ranch, leaving the chaos of the failed drilling party behind us in the rearview mirror. The night should have been peaceful. We had won. The land was safe, protected by federal law. Connor was ruined, exposing his fraud to the very people he owed millions to. It should have been the end of the story. But as I watched the headlights of a car rapidly approaching us from behind, growing brighter and brighter until they blinded me in the mirrors, I knew that a wounded animal is most dangerous right before it dies. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the Russians. It was a black sports car driven with the reckless abandonment of a man who has nothing left to lose. He didn't honk. He didn't flash his lights. He just rammed us. The impact threw me forward against the steering wheel. The heavy steel bumper of the Ford truck absorbed most of the blow, but the force sent us skidding across the wet asphalt. Zoe screamed, grabbing the dashboard as I fought to regain control. "Hang on!" I shouted, spinning the wheel into the skid, trying to keep us out of the ditch. The sports car hit us again harder this time, aiming for the rear axle. The truck spun 180 degrees tires, screaming in protest, before sliding backward off the road and slamming into a utility pole with a bone-jarring crunch. The world went black for a second. My head hit the side window, shattering the glass. I tasted blood. The hiss of the radiator was the only sound in the quiet night. I shook my head, trying to clear the ringing in my ears. "Zoe!" I called out, reaching into the darkness of the cab. "Are you okay?" There was no answer. The passenger door was open. I scrambled out of the truck, stumbling on my bad knee. The red taillights of the sports car were idling just a few yards away. In the red glow, I saw him. Connor Sterling. He wasn't the polished businessman anymore. His suit was torn, mud stained his knees. His hair was wild, sticking up in sweaty clumps, and in his hand, pressed tight against my daughter's temple, was the black Glock pistol. "Stay back, old man!" Connor screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Stay back, or I paint the road with her." Zoe was crying, her hands bound in front of her with what looked like a zip tie. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror, pleading for me not to move. "Connor," I said, raising my hands, slowly wiping the blood from my forehead. "It is over, son." The Russians walked away. "The land is worthless to you. Let her go." "Worthless." Connor laughed, a jagged, manic sound that made my skin crawl. "You think this is about the land anymore? You think I care about the dirt?" He dragged Zoe backward toward his car. "The Russians gave me an ultimatum, Thaddeus," he shouted. $10 million. Tonight, or they start cutting pieces off me. They don't care about the land. They want their money. And since I don't have it anymore thanks to you, I need a new plan." He shoved Zoe into the passenger seat of his car and slammed the door. He kept the gun trained on me through the open window. "You have money," Connor yelled. "I know you do. You have connections. You have that hidden cash you used to pay the geologist." "I have a pension." "Connor," I said, stepping forward. "I don't have $10 million. Nobody does." "Then find it," he screamed, firing a shot into the dirt at my feet. The muzzle flash blinded me for a second. "Find it. Thaddeus. Beg, borrow, steal, I don't care. You have 2 hours. If you don't bring 10 million in cash to the old textile mill by midnight, I am going to give the Russians what they want. I will give them her." He revved the engine. "They trade in human trafficking too, Thaddeus," he sneered. "A pretty girl like Zoe, she might settle a chunk of my debt." "No," I roared, lunging forward, but I was too slow. The sports car peeled away, kicking up gravel and dust, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me standing alone on the side of the road with the echo of his threat ringing in my ears. I didn't call the police. Sheriff Miller was a good man, but he followed procedure. He would set up a perimeter. He would call in a negotiator. He would wait. And while he waited, Connor would panic. A man in Connor's state of mind doesn't negotiate. He escalates. If he saw a police cruiser, he would kill Zoe before they even got out of the car. I needed to handle this myself. I limped back to my truck. The engine was dead, the radiator smashed. I tried to start it, but it just clicked mournfully. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, screaming a curse into the night that I hadn't used since 1968. I walked 3 miles back to the motel, my dress shoes blistering my feet, my head throbbing. I didn't feel the pain. All I felt was the cold, calculating rage that was slowly freezing my heart. I reached the motel room and kicked the door open. It was empty, silent. The unfinished chess game of life still sitting on the table. I went to the bed. I didn't sit down. I knelt on the floor and reached underneath the frame. I pulled out the trunk. It wasn't a suitcase. It was a heavy steel footlocker painted olive drab, scarred and dented from years of travel. I had carried this locker from basic training to the jungle and back again. It had followed me through every construction site, every move, every tragedy. Beatrice used to ask me to throw it away. She said it smelled like old canvas and bad memories, but I kept it, because a soldier never throws away his kit. You never know when the war is going to come back to you. I unlatched the heavy metal clasps. They snapped open with a sound like a gunshot. I opened the lid. The smell hit me first. Gun oil, mothballs, and something else. The smell of fear and adrenaline preserved in fabric for 50 years. On top lay my old uniform. The tiger stripe camouflage was faded but clean folded with military precision. I pushed it aside. Underneath was the vest, an old flak jacket heavy with ceramic plates. I pulled it out, testing the weight. It felt good. It felt familiar. Then came the tools. A K-bar knife with a leather handle worn smooth by my grip. A pouch of magnesium flares. A coil of tripwire. A pair of night vision binoculars that looked like they belonged in a museum but worked better than anything you could buy at a store. And at the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, was the old friend. I unwrapped it slowly. The M14 rifle lay there dark and menacing. It wasn't a modern plastic assault rifle. It was wood and steel, heavy, accurate. A weapon designed for one thing, reaching out and touching someone from a long way away. I picked it up. My hands remembered every curve, every scratch. I pulled the charging handle back. The action was stiff but smooth. I checked the chamber. Clean. I looked at the box of ammunition beside it. 7.62 millimeter full metal jacket. The kind of round that doesn't care about car doors or body armor. I stripped off my ruined suit. I tore off the tie that felt like a noose. I put on the black tactical pants I had bought at the surplus store years ago. I pulled on a dark thermal shirt. I laced up my combat boots tight, feeling the support around my ankles. I put on the vest. It was heavy, restricting my breathing for a second until I adjusted the straps. I slotted the knife into the sheath on my chest. I loaded the magazines, snapping them into the pouches. I caught my reflection in the motel mirror. The old man was gone. Thaddeus the builder was gone. Thaddeus the father was gone. Staring back at me was a ghost. A ghost from the jungle. A ghost who knew how to move through the dark without making a sound. A ghost who knew that the only way to negotiate with a terrorist is to stop his heart. I checked my watch. 1 hour left. Connor was at the old textile mill. I knew the place. I had done the demolition survey on it 10 years ago. It was a maze of catwalks, brick walls, and shadows, a kill box. He thought he had the advantage. He thought he had a hostage and a gun. He thought I was scrambling to find cash. He was wrong. I picked up the M14 and slung it over my shoulder. I turned off the light, leaving the room in darkness. I wasn't bringing him money. I was bringing him payment, just not the currency he expected. I walked out of the motel room and into the night. I hot-wired a parked sedan in the lot, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager in Chicago. The engine roared to life. I drove toward the mill. I didn't speed. I drove with the calm precision of a surgeon on his way to the operating theater. Connor Sterling had woken the beast. He had poked the lion in the cage thinking it was toothless. Tonight he was going to learn a lesson that all the money in the world couldn't buy. "Hello, old friend," I whispered, patting the stock of the rifle. "It is time to go to work." The old textile mill sat on the edge of the river like a rotting tooth in a black mouth. The brick walls were crumbling and the windows were jagged holes that stared blindly into the night. It was a place where the city dumped its garbage and its secrets. I parked the sedan a mile away, deep in the woods under the cover of a weeping willow. I didn't want them to hear an engine. I wanted them to hear nothing until it was too late. I stepped out of the car and the humid Georgia air wrapped around me like a wet blanket. It was heavy and thick, carrying the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. To most people, it was just a forest at night. To me, it was a memory. It smelled like 1968. It smelled like the jungle. I adjusted the straps of my flak jacket. The weight was familiar. It pressed against my chest like an old friend reminding me to breathe shallow and slow. I checked the M14 one last time. I didn't rack the slide. That sound carries for half a mile in the quiet woods. I had already chambered a round back at the motel. The safety was off. I moved into the tree line. My knees popped slightly, but the pain was distant. Adrenaline is a powerful drug. It masks the aches of age and sharpens the senses. My eyesight, which usually struggled with fine print in the morning paper, was now razor sharp, adjusting to the gloom with predatory focus. I didn't run. Running is for prey. Running makes noise. I walked with a rolling gait, placing the outside of my boot down first, then rolling to the inside, feeling for twigs or dry leaves before committing my weight. It was a dance I hadn't practiced in 50 years, but the muscle memory was etched into my bones. I reached the perimeter fence of the mill. The chain link was rusted and overgrown with kudzu vines. I knelt down and pulled out the night vision binoculars. The green phosphor screen flickered to life. I scanned the yard. Connor had hired muscle. I counted 4 of them patrolling the grounds. They were dressed in black tactical gear, holding assault rifles that looked brand new. They looked intimidating, but they were making mistakes. Amateur mistakes. One was smoking a cigarette, the cherry burning bright white in my night vision like a beacon saying, "Here I am, come and get me." Another was checking his phone, the blue light illuminating his face and destroying his natural night vision. They were bored. They were arrogant. They thought they were guarding a perimeter against a scared old man with a checkbook. They didn't know they were standing in a kill box. I put the binoculars away. I drew the Ka bar knife from my chest rig. The leather handle was warm in my hand. The blade was cold steel, blackened to prevent reflection. I slipped through a hole in the fence, moving as silent as smoke. The smoker was my first target. He was standing near a stack of old pallets, his back to the woods. He took a long drag, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke into the air. He was relaxed. He was thinking about how he was going to spend his cut of the money. He never finished the thought. I came up behind him. I didn't touch him. I didn't breathe on his neck. I waited until the wind rustled the trees, masking my final step. I wrapped my left arm around his throat, cutting off the air instantly. He thrashed his boots, scraping against the gravel, but I held tight. I wasn't trying to kill him. I applied pressure to the carotid artery. 5 seconds. That is all it takes. His body went limp. The rifle slipped from his hands, but I caught it before it hit the ground. I lowered him gently to the earth. I took his radio and crushed it under my boot. Then I dragged him into the shadows of the kudzu. One down, I moved deeper into the yard. The mill was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and brick pillars. I stuck to the shadows, becoming part of the darkness. 2 guards were walking a patrol route together, talking loudly. "Did you see the game last night?" one asked. "Yeah, the Falcons blew it again." The other replied, laughing. "Discipline. They had none. In the jungle, noise is death. Here it was just stupidity. I couldn't take 2 at once, not at my age. I needed to separate them. I reached into my pouch and pulled out a magnesium flare. I didn't light it. I picked up a heavy bolt from the ground and tossed it toward a corrugated metal shed 30 yards away. Clang. The sound was sharp and metallic. The two guards froze. They raised their rifles. "What was that?" the first one whispered. "Probably a raccoon," the second said, but his voice was unsure. "Go check it out," the first one ordered. "I will cover you. Divide and conquer." The second guard moved toward the shed, his rifle raised. The first guard stayed back, scanning the darkness. He was looking everywhere except where I was. I was directly above him. I had climbed the rusted ladder of a water tank while they were talking. I was 10 feet up, perched on a steel beam. My joints screamed in protest, but I ignored them. I waited until the second guard disappeared around the corner of the shed. I dropped. I landed behind the first guard, my boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He opened his mouth to shout, but the butt of my M14 connected with his temple. It was a solid, sickening crack. He dropped like a sack of cement. I didn't stop. I knew the other guard would hear the body fall. I rolled behind a concrete pillar just as the second guard came running back around the corner. "Mike," he shouted. "Mike, you okay?" He saw his partner lying on the ground. He panicked. He didn't take cover. He ran straight to the body. Mistake number 2, always clear the area before checking the casualty. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I didn't raise my rifle. I just stood there, a ghost in black armor emerging from the gloom. The guard looked up. He saw the face of a man who had hunted things far more dangerous than him. He saw the cold, dead eyes of a soldier who had nothing left to lose. He froze. His finger hovered over the trigger of his fancy assault rifle. "Drop it," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It was a low growl that vibrated in the air. He hesitated. He was young. He was scared. He looked at his unconscious friend, then back at me. I said, "Drop it," I repeated, taking a step forward. "Or you won't leave this yard." The fear won. The gun clattered to the ground. He raised his hands, trembling. "Run," I said, pointing toward the gate. "Run, and don't stop." He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted toward the fence, leaving his weapon and his dignity in the dirt. 3 down. The last guard was the heavy. I had seen him earlier. A big man built like a linebacker standing guard at the main entrance to the mill building. He wouldn't be easily distracted. I checked my watch. Midnight. Time was up. I walked openly toward the main entrance. I let my boots crunch on the gravel. I wanted him to see me. The guard saw me coming. He raised his rifle, shouting a warning. "Stop right there, old man. Hands where I can see them." I kept walking. I held the M14 across my chest in a low, ready position. "I have a message for Connor," I said, keeping my pace steady. The guard sneered. "Unless that message is $10 million cash, you can turn around and walk away." "The message is eviction," I said. He fired a warning shot. The bullet kicked up dust 2 feet in front of me. "That was your only warning," he shouted. "Next one goes in your chest." I stopped. I was 20 yards away, too far for a rush, too close to miss. I looked him in the eye. "You are fighting for a paycheck, son," I said. "I am fighting for my daughter. Who do you think pulls the trigger first?" He hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. He was doing the math. He was looking at the way I stood, the way I held the weapon. He realized that while he was aiming, I was already on target. He lowered his rifle slowly. "I don't get paid enough for this," he muttered, spitting on the ground. He stepped aside. He unlocked the heavy steel door and pushed it open. "Smart man," I said, passing him. I walked into the mill. The air inside was stale, smelling of mold and old cotton. Shafts of moonlight cut through the holes in the roof, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was quiet. Too quiet. I moved through the main floor, my rifle raised. I swept the corners. Clear. Clear. I heard a sound, a whimper. It was coming from the upper catwalk. I found the stairs. They were rusted metal, groaning under my weight. I climbed slowly, keeping my eyes on the landing above. I reached the top. The catwalk ran the length of the building, ending in a small office with glass walls that overlooked the factory floor. A single battery-powered lantern was burning inside. I walked toward the light. I saw them. Zoe was tied to a chair in the center of the room. Her mouth was taped shut. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was alive. She saw me through the glass and her eyes widened with relief and terror. Behind her stood Connor. He looked terrible. He had lost his jacket. His shirt was soaked with sweat sticking to his skin. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. He looked like a man whose mind had finally snapped under the weight of his own lies. He held the Glock loosely in his hand, waving it around as he talked to the empty room. I kicked the door open. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. Connor spun around. He brought the gun up, but his hand was shaking so bad he could barely aim. "Thaddeus," I shouted, leveling the M14 at his chest. Connor blinked, trying to focus. He looked at me. He looked at the tactical vest, the knife, the rifle. He looked at the mud on my boots and the darkness in my eyes. He laughed. A weak, broken sound. "You came," he whispered. "Did you bring the money?" I took a step into the room. "No, Connor," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. "I brought the bill." Connor stumbled back, pressing the gun against Zoe's head. She squeezed her eyes shut, whimpering behind the tape. "Don't come any closer," Connor screamed, saliva flying from his mouth. "I will do it. I swear to God, I will do it. The Russians are coming. They are going to kill me anyway. I might as well take her with me." He was erratic, unstable. This wasn't a calculated move anymore. This was suicide. I looked at his finger on the trigger. It was white with tension. One twitch and my world ended. I lowered my rifle slightly. "Look at me, Connor," I said, softening my voice. "Look at me. The Russians aren't coming." "Liar," he shrieked. "They texted me. They said midnight." I took another step. "They aren't coming because I called them. I lied. I told them you had the money. I told them we were meeting here to make the exchange. They are waiting for you, Connor. But they are waiting at the bank, not here." Connor paused. Confusion clouded his eyes. "The bank," he mumbled. "Yes," I said, keeping eye contact. "Put the gun down, Connor. You can still walk away. You can go to them. You can explain." He wavered. For a second I saw the businessman trying to calculate the odds. He lowered the gun an inch away from Zoe's head. Just an inch. That was all I needed. But then his phone buzzed on the desk. Connor looked at it. The screen lit up. It was a text message. He read it. His face went pale. Then it turned red with rage. "You are lying," he whispered, looking back at me. "It is them. They say they know I am here. They say nobody leaves." He raised the gun again, screaming in frustration. "No!" I didn't have a choice. The negotiation was over. I didn't aim for his head. I didn't aim for his chest. I aimed for the shoulder. The one holding the gun. I squeezed the trigger. The M14 roared in the confined space. The muzzle flash lit up the room like a lightning strike. The bullet hit Connor in the upper right shoulder, spinning him around like a rag doll. The Glock flew from his hand, skidding across the floor. He screamed a sound of pure agony and collapsed against the back wall, clutching his shattered arm. Zoe screamed behind the tape, throwing herself sideways, chair and all, to get away from him. I didn't hesitate. I crossed the room in 2 strides. I kicked the Glock away into the darkness. I grabbed Connor by his shirt and slammed him against the glass wall. He slid down, groaning, blood pooling on the floor. "It is over," I said, standing over him. I turned to Zoe. I pulled the knife from my vest. She flinched, but I just cut the tape on her wrists and ankles. She launched herself at me, burying her face in my tactical vest, sobbing uncontrollably. "I got you, baby girl," I whispered, smoothing her hair with my trembling hand. "I got you. Dad," she cried. "You shot him." "He gave me no choice," I said. I looked back at Connor. He was curled in a fetal position, whimpering. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. He was just a broken man in a ruined suit. "We need to go," I said. "The gunshot will bring the police. Or worse." I helped Zoe up. We walked toward the door. But before we could leave, the building began to shake. A low rumble started from the ground floor, growing louder and louder until the glass walls of the office rattled. "What is that?" Zoe asked, gripping my arm. I looked out the window down at the factory floor. Headlights, dozens of them. Black SUVs were pouring into the yard surrounding the mill. Doors opened. Men in heavy coats stepped out carrying weapons that made my M14 look like a toy. "The Russians," I whispered. They hadn't waited at the bank. They had tracked Connor's phone. And they weren't here for money anymore. They were here to clean up the mess. I looked at the only exit. It was blocked. "We are trapped," Zoe whispered. I looked around the office. There was no way out. We were sitting ducks in a glass cage. I looked at Connor bleeding on the floor. Then I looked at my daughter. I grabbed a heavy steel chair and smashed the rear window of the office that overlooked the river. "Can you swim?" I asked Zoe. She looked down. It was a 50-foot drop into the black churning water. "Dad, no," she said, terrified. "It is the only way," I said. I could hear boots pounding up the metal stairs. They were coming. I picked up Zoe. I didn't give her time to argue. "Trust me," I said. I threw the rifle aside. I held her hand. On 3, I said, 1, 2. Suddenly the door to the office exploded inward. 3. We jumped into the void just as the room filled with gunfire. We didn't make the jump. We didn't have time. Just as my boots left the floor, the heavy steel door of the office blew inward off its hinges. The force of the explosion threw us backward away from the shattered window and back into the glass cage with the monster. The blast wave knocked the wind out of me, and for a second the world was nothing but ringing ears and dust. I landed hard on my bad shoulder, feeling something pop, but I ignored it. Pain is just information, and right now the information was telling me we were trapped. I scrambled to my feet, coughing in the acrid smoke. The Russians hadn't entered the room yet. They were moving methodically, sweeping the lower floors, securing the perimeter like the professionals they were. That gave us maybe 2 minutes. 2 minutes before they came up those stairs and turned this office into a slaughterhouse. I looked for Zoe. She was huddled in the corner where the blast had thrown her. She wasn't hurt, just terrified. Her eyes were darting around the room looking for an exit that didn't exist. And then there was Connor. The explosion had knocked him against the file cabinets. He was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pale, sweaty shock. But he was laughing. It was a wet, gurgling sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. He looked at the door, then he looked at us. You see, he wheezed, spitting blood onto the floor. "You can't escape. Nobody escapes. The debt has to be paid, Thaddeus. If I can't pay with money, I will pay with souls." He began to crawl toward the Glock I had kicked away earlier. It had slid under the desk near his feet. I took a step toward him, intending to finish what I started, but Zoe screamed, "Dad, look out." I spun around. A laser sight cut through the smoke, sweeping across the room. The Russians were at the bottom of the stairs. They were taking aim. We were pinned down. If I moved toward Connor, I would be in the line of fire. If I stayed where I was, we were sitting ducks. I grabbed Zoe and pulled her behind the heavy oak desk, flipping it onto its side to create a barricade. Bullets started to chew up the wood, sending splinters flying like angry hornets. "We are going to die here," Zoe sobbed, burying her face in my chest. "I deserve it, Dad. I deserve it for what I did. I killed that man. I am a murderer." The sound of her guilt broke my heart more than the bullets ever could. She was 19 years old when it happened. She had carried this weight, this lie, for 6 months. It had eaten her alive. It had made her weak enough to let a predator like Connor Sterling put a collar around her neck. I grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard. "Listen to me," I shouted over the roar of gunfire. "Look at me, Zoe." She looked up, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "You didn't kill anyone," I said. My voice was steady, a rock in the middle of the storm. She shook her head. "I did, Dad. I felt the impact. I saw the blood." "Connor saw it." "Connor saw what he wanted you to see," I roared. I pulled my phone out of my tactical vest. I hit the button for Marcus's live stream. The screen lit up. "Tell her, Marcus," I shouted into the phone. "Tell her what you found." Marcus's voice came through the speaker, tinny but clear, cutting through the chaos. "Zoe, listen to me." I ran facial recognition on the dash cam footage. "I found the man you hit. His name is Ray Perkins. He is a stuntman from Tampa. He specializes in high falls and vehicle impacts." Zoe stared at the phone, her mouth opening in shock. What she whispered. "He is alive." Zoe, Marcus continued. "I found his Instagram. He posted a picture yesterday. He is surfing in Florida. He just bought a new boat. He tagged it. Thanks for the bonus." "Connor." I looked at Zoe, seeing the gears turning in her mind. The confusion, the disbelief, and then the dawning realization. It was a setup, I said, staring deep into her eyes. The rain, the dark road, the man jumping out, the blood packets. "It was all a show, Zoe. Connor hired him. He staged the whole thing. He knew you would panic. He knew you would call him. He needed leverage to force you to marry him so he could get the ranch." Zoe went rigid. Her body, which had been trembling with fear, suddenly went perfectly still. She turned her head slowly to look over the top of the barricade. Connor had reached the gun. He was leaning against the file cabinet, holding the weapon with his shaking left hand. He was grinning at us, a look of pure malice. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The look on his face said everything. "It was a good performance, wasn't it?" Connor shouted, his voice slurred. "Ray is a professional. Cost me 50 grand. But it was worth every penny to see you crumble, Zoe. You were so easy to break, so easy to manipulate." He laughed again, wiping blood from his mouth. "You spent 6 months crying over a ghost, darling. You let me own you because you thought you were a monster. But the only monster here is me." Something snapped in the room. It wasn't a sound, it was a shift in energy. I felt Zoe pull away from me. "Zoe, stay down," I warned, grabbing for her arm. She didn't listen. She looked down at her ankles, which were still bound by the zip ties I hadn't had time to cut. She looked at the floor. There was a shard of glass from the shattered window. It was long and jagged, shaped like a dagger. Zoe grabbed it. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She sawed at the plastic ties on her ankles. The glass sliced into her skin, mixing her blood with the dirt, but she didn't even blink. Snap. The ties broke. Zoe stood up. She wasn't the little girl I had carried on my shoulders. She wasn't the bride shaking at the altar. She was a king. She was the daughter of a woman who tamed wild horses and a man who survived the jungle. "Zoe, get back down," I shouted, reaching for her. She stepped out from behind the desk. She walked right into the open, right into the line of fire. The Russian shooters paused. Even they were surprised by the sight of a woman in a torn wedding dress walking through a hail of bullets like she was walking down a runway. Connor saw her coming. His smile faltered. "Get back!" he screamed, raising the gun. "Get back, or I will kill you for real this time." Zoe didn't stop. She didn't run. She walked. Her steps were heavy, deliberate. Her eyes were locked on his. "You stole my life," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a power that silenced the room. "You made me hate myself. You made me wish I was dead." She took another step, 10 feet away. "Shoot me," then she challenged, spreading her arms. "Go ahead, Connor, finish the movie. But there are no stuntmen here. This is real." Connor's hand shook violently. He was a bully, and bullies are terrified of victims who don't act like victims. He tried to aim, but Zoe's intensity was a physical force pushing him back. "I said stay back!" he shrieked, squeezing the trigger. Bang! The bullet went wild, hitting the ceiling. Connor was too weak, too panicked. Zoe lunged. It was an explosion of movement. She closed the distance in a second. She didn't go for his face. She went for the gun. She kicked. A high martial arts kick that I had paid for when she was 12 years old and thought she had forgotten. Her heel connected with Connor's wrist. Crack. The sound of bone breaking was distinct. The Glock flew out of his hand, spinning through the air and sliding across the floor toward the edge of the broken window. Connor screamed, clutching his broken wrist, falling to his knees. Zoe stood over him. She looked 10 feet tall. She looked like an avenging angel covered in soot and blood. She grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit. She hauled him up until his face was inches from hers. "I am not your property," she hissed. "I am not your leverage. And I am certainly not your wife." She shoved him back. Connor stumbled, tripping over his own feet, and fell hard against the wall. I watched from behind the desk, my heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost brought me to knees. She had done it. She had broken the spell, but the moment was cut short. The stairs rattled. Heavy boots hit the metal landing. The Russians were here. I grabbed the M14 and vaulted over the desk. "Zoe, get down!" I roared. The first Russian stepped through the doorway. He was huge, wearing a balaclava and holding a short-barreled AK-47. He didn't look at Connor. He didn't look at Zoe. He looked at me. "Mr. King," a deep voice boomed from behind the mask. I raised my rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop the weapon," the Russian said. I didn't drop it. I stood in front of my daughter, shielding her with my body. "If you want her, you have to go through me," I said. The Russian laughed, a low rumble. "We do not want the girl," he said, lowering his gun slightly. "We want the money. And since Mr. Sterling here has failed to pay," he looked past me at Connor, who was cowering in the corner. "We are entering the liquidation phase of our contract. I realized then that they weren't here to kill us. They were here to collect their collateral, and the collateral was the man screaming on the floor. But Connor wasn't done yet. He saw the Russians. He saw me. He saw the gun lying near the edge of the drop. He scrambled for it, not to shoot us, but to shoot his way out. He grabbed the Glock with his good hand. "Connor, don't!" I shouted. He didn't listen. He raised the gun, aiming at the Russian in the doorway. Big mistake. The Russian didn't even blink. He raised his AK. But before anyone could fire, Zoe moved again. She didn't run away. She didn't hide. She grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the wall. She swung it. It hit Connor square in the chest just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. The force of the blow lifted Connor off his feet. He flew backward, through the broken window, out into the night. We heard his scream fade as he fell 50 feet into the black water below. Splash. Then silence. Zoe dropped the fire extinguisher. She walked to the edge and looked down. The Russian lowered his gun. He walked to the window and looked down too. He nodded slowly. "Liquidation complete," he said. He turned to me. "You are a hard man to kill, Mr. King." He signaled his men. They turned and walked away, disappearing down the stairs as quickly as they had come, leaving us alone in the ruined office with the cold wind blowing in from the river. I walked over to Zoe. She was shaking now, the adrenaline fading. I put my arm around her. "Is it over?" she whispered, looking at the dark water. I looked at the ripples fading in the river. "The lie is over," I said. "The truth is all that is left." And the truth was, we were alive. I looked down at the black water of the river churning below the broken window. For a moment I thought it was over. I thought the river had swallowed Connor Sterling and all his lies. But cockroaches are hard to kill. A minute later I saw movement on the muddy bank. Connor dragged himself out of the water, coughing and retching, clutching his broken wrist. He was shivering violently, soaking wet and defeated, but he was alive. I turned to Zoe. She was leaning against the wall, shaking not from cold, but from the aftershocks of adrenaline. "It is done," I said, "but we are not finished yet." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Blue lights began to flash against the brick walls of the old mill, mixing with the orange glow of the fire that had started in the lower office during the gunfight. Marcus had come through, the police were here, but they weren't the only ones. Through the shattered window I saw the black SUVs of the Russian mob circling the perimeter. They were like sharks smelling blood in the water. They had seen Connor fall. They knew their investment had just washed up on the shore. We walked down the metal stairs. My knees protested with every step, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt only the weight of my daughter's hand in mine. We exited the main doors of the mill just as Sheriff Miller's cruiser screeched to a halt in the gravel yard. Deputies poured out guns drawn shouting orders. "Drop the weapons, hands in the air." I handed the M14 to a young deputy who looked terrified to take it. I raised my hand slowly, showing them I was not a threat. Sheriff Miller ran over to us. He looked at me, then at Zoe, then at the burning building. "Thaddeus, what in God's name happened here?" Miller shouted over the roar of the fire. "Kidnapping," I said calmly, pointing toward the riverbank. "Attempted murder, and a whole lot of bad decisions." Miller signaled his men. They moved toward the riverbank where Connor was lying in the mud. He was trying to crawl away, but he had nowhere to go. But before the deputies could reach him, the black SUVs rolled forward, blocking their path. The doors opened. The Russian team stepped out. They didn't raise their weapons. They didn't shout. They just stood there, forming a silent wall between the police and Connor. The deputies froze. This was above their pay grade. This was federal. This was organized crime. Sheriff Miller put his hand on his holster. I stepped in front of him. "Wait, Jim," I said quietly. "Let them have a moment." The Russian boss, the man with the face like granite, walked slowly toward Connor. He stopped 5 feet away. He looked down at the shivering, broken man who had promised him $10 million. Connor looked up. His eyes were wide with a terror that transcended the fear of arrest. He knew that prison was a sanctuary compared to what these men would do to him. "Please," Connor screamed, crawling toward the police. "Sheriff, arrest me! Please arrest me! Take me away!" The Russian boss didn't touch him. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cigar. He lit it, staring at Connor through the smoke. "You have caused me a great deal of inconvenience, Mr. Sterling," the Russian said, his voice low and heavy. I walked over to them. The deputies watched me nervously, but they didn't stop me. I stood between the mob boss and the criminal. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a set of keys. They were the keys to the ranch. The keys Connor had demanded, the keys to the kingdom he thought he conquered. I looked at the Russian. "He has no money," I said, my voice flat. "He has no lithium. He has no land. The deed he signed is worthless because the land is federally protected. You can't drill on it. You can't sell it. The Russian looked at me. He took a drag of his cigar. I know, he said. My analysts confirmed your little zoning trick 10 minutes ago. Very clever, Mr. King. He looked back at Connor, who was sobbing in the mud. So he is useless to us, the Russian concluded. A bad investment. I tossed the keys into the mud right in front of Connor's face. He is all yours, I said. I don't care what you do with him. I don't care about the money. I just want my daughter, and I want to go home. Connor scrambled for the keys, clutching them like a talisman. He looked at the Russian, then at the police. Arrest me, he shrieked again, his voice breaking. I confess. I did it all. The fraud, the kidnapping, the accident. Just put me in a cell. Don't let them take me. The Russian boss smiled. It was a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. We are not going to take you, Mr. Sterling, he said. We are businessmen, not kidnappers. We will let the American justice system handle you. He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Connor. But prison is a small world, the Russian whispered loud enough for me to hear, and my organization has a very long reach. We have friends in every cell block from Atlanta to Alcatraz. You will serve your time. And every day you will wonder if the man in the bunk next to you works for me. You will never sleep soundly again. That is your payment. Connor collapsed face down in the dirt, wailing. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. He was going to prison, but he had just been handed a life sentence of fear. The Russian boss straightened up. He looked at me. He nodded once, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another. Good luck, Mr. King, he said. He turned and walked back to his SUV. The Russians got in and drove away, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had arrived, leaving only the smell of expensive tobacco and impending doom. Sheriff Miller moved in. Get him up, he ordered his deputies. They hauled Connor to his feet. He was limp, weeping openly. As they dragged him past me, he looked up. His eyes were empty. He was a broken shell of a man. I didn't say anything. I didn't gloat. I just watched him get stuffed into the back of the cruiser. The cage door slammed shut. It was the sound of a book closing. Zoe walked up beside me. She was wrapped in a blanket a paramedic had given her. She watched the flashing lights of the police car fade into the distance. Is he going to die? She asked softly. I put my arm around her shoulders. He is already dead, baby girl, I said. He died the moment he chose money over family. What is left in that car is just a ghost. I turned her away from the scene. Behind us, the old mill was fully engulfed in flames now. The fire roared, consuming the office where we had almost died, consuming the lies and the fear. The heat was intense on our backs, but it felt cleansing. It was burning away the rot. Let's go, I said, steering her toward the main road. Where, she asked. We don't have a home. The ranch house is gone. I stopped. I looked at her. Her face was dirty. Her dress was ruined, but her eyes were clear. The shadow that had hung over her for 6 months was gone. Home isn't a building, Zoe, I said. Home is where your people are. We have the land. We have each other. We can buy a tent. We can build a cabin. We can start over. We walked away from the fire into the cool darkness of the morning. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I looked at my hands. They were bruised and bloody. They were the hands of a builder and the hands of a soldier. Today, they had been both. I took a deep breath of the fresh air. It smelled of smoke, but underneath that it smelled of pine and earth. It smelled of freedom. The wolves had been chased away. The debt had been paid. And as I walked down that road with my daughter, I knew that the King legacy hadn't been destroyed. It had just been forged in fire. I am Thaddeus King. I am 72 years old, and I am just getting started. The wheels of justice usually turn slow, but when you grease them with a mountain of digital evidence and the confession of a broken man, they grind exceedingly fine. 2 days after the fire at the mill, I walked into the district attorney's office. I didn't go alone. I brought Marcus, and I brought a hard drive that contained the entire rot of the Sterling Empire. Connor hadn't just targeted me, he had targeted everyone. The files Marcus unlocked showed a Ponzi scheme that spanned 3 states. He had taken money from pension funds, from widows, from charity organizations, promising them returns from a lithium mine that didn't exist. He had used that money to pay for his cars, his suits, and the stuntman who pretended to die on a rainy road. I sat across from the investigators' men in cheap suits who looked tired. I laid it all out. I gave them the emails, the bank transfers, and the recording from the restaurant. I watched their eyes go wide. They realized this wasn't just a local fraud case. It was the headline of the year. By the time I left the building, the Sterling family name was dead. Connor's parents, the ones who had looked down their noses at me during the wedding, were watching their assets being frozen. Their mansion, their yacht, their country club memberships, everything was seized to pay back the investors their son had swindled. They lost their dignity. They lost their standing. They were left with nothing but the shame of raising a monster. But I didn't care about the Sterlings. I cared about my daughter. The following week, Zoe stood in a courtroom. The air was cold and smelled of floor wax and anxiety. She wore a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back. She looked young, too young to be facing a judge. The charges were serious on paper: leaving the scene of an accident, failure to report. But the law is a structure, and every structure relies on a foundation of facts. And the facts were on our side. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with glasses, laid out the case. She talked about the crash. She talked about Zoe driving away. It looked bad. Then it was our turn. Our lawyer, a man I had hired with the last of my savings, stood up. He didn't make a speech. He simply called a witness. He didn't call the stuntman. He called the lead investigator. "Detective," the lawyer asked, "in your investigation of the alleged accident site, did you find any blood?" The detective shifted in his seat. "We found a red substance, sir, but lab analysis confirmed it was corn syrup and food coloring. Stage blood." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "And the victim?" the lawyer continued. "Mr. Ray Perkins, is he deceased?" "No, sir," the detective said, looking at his notes. "Mr. Perkins was apprehended in Key West 3 days ago. He is currently in custody for fraud and conspiracy. He has testified that he was hired by Connor Sterling to stage the accident." The lawyer turned to the judge. "Your Honor, there was no body, there was no injury, there was no death. My client fled the scene because she was being psychologically manipulated by a predator who staged a violent event to coerce her into a marriage and financial extortion. She wasn't a criminal. She was a victim of an elaborate hostage situation that lasted 6 months." The courtroom went silent. I looked at Zoe. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking at the judge, her chin held high. The judge was an old man with eyes like flint. He looked at the evidence. He looked at the confession from Connor. He looked at my daughter. He banged his gavel. The sound cracked like a whip. "Case dismissed." The judge said, his voice cutting through the tension. He looked at Zoe over his spectacles. "Young lady," he said softly, "you have been through a hell that no one should have to endure. You are free to go." Zoe let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for half a year. She turned and looked at me. I stood up and opened my arms. She ran to me, burying her face in my shoulder. We stood there in the middle of the courtroom, holding each other while the world kept turning. We had won. The legal nightmare was over, but we were still homeless. The bank had seized the ranch. Since the deed transfer to Connor was technically legal before his arrest, the property was now considered an asset of a criminal enterprise. It was seized by the state and put up for immediate auction to pay off Connor's creditors. My grandfather's land, my father's legacy. It was going to be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. The auction was set for a rainy Tuesday morning. I put on my best suit. I polished my shoes until I could see my reflection in the leather. I drove the rental car to the courthouse with Zoe sitting beside me. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" she asked nervously. "We don't have $50 million. We don't even have 50,000. "Trust me," I said. The courthouse steps were crowded. There were developers there, men in expensive raincoats holding umbrellas. There were representatives from corporate farming conglomerates. They were all there to pick the bones of the King Legacy Ranch. They smelled a bargain. But as they stood there murmuring among themselves, checking their phones, I saw the doubt creeping into their eyes. Word travels fast in this town. They had heard the rumors. They knew the land was designated as a protected groundwater reserve, meaning they couldn't build condos or drill for oil. They knew the previous owner was sitting in a federal prison cell fearing for his life. And most importantly, they knew about the Russians. Rumors are a powerful weapon. I had made sure the story got out. The story that the Russian mob still felt they were owed something. The story that they considered the land cursed. The story that anyone who bought that land might find themselves waking up to a black SUV parked in their driveway. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium. He looked nervous. He knew this was a tainted sale. "We are here to auction the property known as the King Legacy Ranch," he announced, his voice trembling slightly. 300 acres, residential zoning denied, commercial zoning denied, mineral rights null and void. The developers looked at each other. No condos, no mines, just dirt. Opening bid, the auctioneer called out, "Do I hear $1 million?" Silence. The only sound was the rain hitting the umbrellas. The developers shifted their feet. $1 million for a piece of land you can't develop and might get you killed by the mafia. It was a bad investment. "Do I hear 500,000? The auctioneer asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Still silence. A man in a beige trench coat stepped forward. He looked like he was about to bid. I stepped forward too. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. I let him see the face of the man who had defended that land with a rifle. I let him see the resolve of a man who had burned down a textile mill to save his daughter. The man in the beige coat looked at me. He looked at the gray sky. He shook his head and stepped back. He folded. 100,000, the auctioneer pleaded. Anyone. I raised my hand. $10,000, I said. My voice was calm, but it carried across the square. The auctioneer looked at me. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the bank representative standing next to him. The banker looked furious, but he also looked resigned. They wanted this toxic asset off their books. They wanted to wash their hands of the Connor Sterling disaster. $10,000 going once, the auctioneer said quickly, wanting to get out of the rain. 10,000 going twice. He scanned the crowd. Nobody moved. The developers were already walking away, getting into their warm cars. They knew when a game was rigged. Sold, the auctioneer shouted, slamming his gavel down. To Mr. Thaddeus King. I walked up the steps. I pulled a cashier's check from my pocket. It was exactly $10,000. The last of my savings, the money I had set aside for a rainy day. Well, today was the rainy day. I took the deed. It was a fresh piece of paper, crisp and white. It didn't have Connor's signature on it. It had mine. I walked back down the steps to where Zoe was waiting. She was crying again, but this time she was smiling. "We got it back," she whispered, touching the paper with trembling fingers. "We got it back," I said. We drove out to the ranch that afternoon. The rain had stopped and the sun was breaking through the clouds. It was a mess. The farmhouse was a pile of rubble. The garden was churned mud. The fences were broken. But the land was still there. The oak trees were still standing. The creek was still running. I parked the truck near the ruins of the porch. We got out. "It is going to take a lot of work," Zoe said, kicking a piece of broken lumber. I picked up a brick. It was one of the original bricks from the fireplace. It was blackened by soot, but it was still solid. I weighed it in my hand. "I am a builder, Zoe," I said. "I built this house once. I can build it again." I looked at her. "And this time," I said, "we build it stronger. We build it with steel-reinforced doors. We build it with the knowledge that we survived the fire." Zoe picked up a shovel that was lying in the grass. She jammed it into the earth. "Where do we start?" she asked. I pointed to the spot where the front door used to be. "We start with the foundation." I said. We worked until sunset, clearing the debris. My back ached and my hands blistered, but it was a good pain. It was the pain of creation, not destruction. As the sun went down, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, I stopped and looked out over the valley. I thought about Connor sitting in a cell looking over his shoulder. I thought about the developers in their high-rise offices. They chased money. They chased power. But standing there on my own dirt covered in sweat and mud, I knew I had something they would never have. I had peace, and I had a clean conscience. The court of law had spoken, but the court of conscience, the one that keeps you awake at night or lets you sleep like a baby, had given its final verdict. We were innocent. We were survivors. And we were home. It took us 12 months to rebuild the farmhouse. We didn't hire a crew. We didn't bring in contractors with blueprints and heavy machinery. We did it the old-fashioned way. Me and Zoe side by side, mixing concrete, laying bricks, and driving nails until our hands were callous and our backs were strong. We built it on the same footprint as the old house, but we changed the design. We made the windows bigger to let in more light. We reinforced the doors with steel frames, and we built a porch that wrapped all the way around the house facing the valley so we could always see who was coming. It is a Saturday morning, exactly 1 year after the fire. The sun is coming up over the ridge, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. The air smells of fresh cedar lumber and brewing coffee. I am sitting on the new rocking chair, polishing my boots just like I always do. But this time I am not polishing them for war. I am polishing them for peace. I look out over the pasture. The grass has grown back, covering the scars left by Connor's bulldozers. The wildflowers are blooming again, defiant and bright. And in the middle of the field, I see them. Horses. Not racehorses, not show ponies. These are rescue horses, animals that have been abused, neglected, and broken by people who didn't understand their worth. Zoe is down there with them. She is leading a mare with a scarred flank around the paddock. Walking next to her is a young woman. I don't know her name, but I know her story. I can see it in the way she holds her shoulders tight and defensive. She is a survivor of domestic violence, just like Zoe. Zoe stops the horse. She places the young woman's hand on the mare's nose. I watch as the tension leaves the woman's body. I watch as she leans her head against the horse's neck and begins to weep. Zoe puts an arm around her. She doesn't say anything. She just holds the space, letting the healing happen. They call it the King Legacy Center. It is a place where women who have been silenced can come to find their voices again. Zoe runs it. She isn't the scared girl who hid in the bathroom anymore. She is a healer. She is a leader. She took the darkest chapter of her life and turned it into a lantern to guide others out of the dark. I take a sip of my coffee. It tastes better than it used to. Maybe because I know I earned it. Or maybe because the silence on the ranch isn't empty anymore. It is full of purpose. I hear footsteps on the porch stairs. Zoe walks up, wiping her hands on her jeans. She looks tired, but her eyes are bright. She looks like her mother. "Good morning, Dad," she says, pouring herself a cup from the pot on the table. "Good morning, baby girl," I say. "How is the new arrival doing?" "She is making progress," Zoe says, sitting on the railing. "She trusts the horses. Humans are harder. But she will get there. It takes time to learn that not every hand is raised to strike you." I nod. I know that lesson well. I reach into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I pull out a small wooden frame. It isn't expensive, just a simple piece of oak I carved myself in the workshop. Inside the frame, behind a piece of glass, is a scrap of paper. It is wrinkled, stained with lipstick, and smeared with dirt. The edges are torn. Zoe looks at it. She freezes. She knows what it is. "Dad," she whispers, "you kept it." I look at the words scrawled on the paper. "Dad, help me. I never told you why I kept this," I say, running my thumb over the glass. "I didn't keep it to remind me of the danger. I didn't keep it to remind me of Connor, or the Russians, or the fire." I look at her. "I kept it to remind me of the most important moment of my life, the moment you trusted me enough to ask." Zoe's eyes fill with tears. "I was so scared that day," she says. "I thought you would be ashamed of me. I thought you would turn away." I stand up. My knees creak, but I stand tall. "A father never turns away, Zoe," I say. "We might get angry. We might get quiet. But when our children call, we answer. That is the job. That is the only job that matters." I walk over to the wall next to the front door. I drive a nail into the fresh wood. I hang the frame there. It is the first thing you see when you walk into the house and the last thing you see when you leave. It stays here, I say, as a reminder, not of the fear, but of the courage it took to break the silence. Zoe walks over and hugs me. She buries her face in my shoulder just like she did in the courtroom, just like she did when she was 5 years old and scraped her knee. "Thank you, Dad," she whispers, "for saving me." I kiss the top of her head. "You saved yourself, baby girl," I say. "I just cleared the path." We stand there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. The light hits the glass of the frame, making the words shine. "Dad, help me." 3 little words that burned down an empire of lies and built a sanctuary of truth. I think about Connor Sterling sitting in a cell somewhere, looking at the wall, waiting for a ghost that might never come. He had money. He had influence. He had charm. But he died alone because he built his life on taking. I look at my daughter. I look at the land. I look at the women down in the pasture finding peace. I built my life on giving. And I am the richest man in the world. I sit back down in my chair. I pick up the shoe brush. Swish, swish, swish. The rhythm is steady. The work is done. The legacy is safe. I am Thaddeus King. And this is my home. We often teach our children to be polite, to keep the peace, and to endure. But silence is not a virtue when it costs you your soul. The greatest legacy a father can leave is not land money or a surname, but the certainty that he will be the wall between his child and the world's cruelty. Trust is earned, not given by blood or marriage, and sometimes you have to burn the fake paradise down to build a real home on solid ground. Never ignore the whispers of your intuition, they are screaming the truth. Thank you for listening to this story. If Thaddeus's journey touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your family, even if it meant risking everything? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay strong and never ignore the truth.